I still vividly remember that day in 1855 when my life changed forever. I was out in the woods near Waldoboro, Maine, chopping firewood like I did most days. It was a crisp autumn morning, and the forest was quiet except for the rhythmic thunk of my axe. I had been at it for a couple hours when I heard the strangest sound echoing through the trees. At first I thought it might be a bird or small animal, but as I listened closer, I realized it was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was almost like a high-pitched shriek or wail, but with an eerily human quality to it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something about that sound just felt wrong and unnatural. I set down my axe and peered into the thick underbrush, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. The shrieking continued, growing more frantic. Against my better judgment, I started pushing through the brush towards the source of the sound. As I got closer, I could hear rustling and movement. Whatever was making that racket was thrashing around in the leaves. Suddenly, I caught a glimpse of movement and froze in my tracks. There, huddled at the base of a large oak tree, was the strangest creature I've ever laid eyes on. It was tiny, no more than 1.5 feet tall, but had an unmistakably humanoid shape. Its body was covered in coarse black hair or fur. When it saw me, the creature let out another piercing shriek and tried to scamper away, but in its panic, it seemed to have gotten tangled in some vines at the base of the tree. As it thrashed and wailed, I could see its face clearly for the first time. My blood ran cold. Its face was disturbingly human-like, with large dark eyes, a flattened nose, and a wide mouth full of small pointed teeth. But the proportions were all wrong. Its head was too large for its body, its arms too long. It wasn't human, but it wasn't quite animal either. For a moment I just stood there in shock, my mind reeling as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The creature stared back at me with what looked like a mixture of fear and confusion in its oversized eyes. I knew I should probably turn and run, pretend I'd never seen this thing. But curiosity got the better of me. Moving slowly so as not to startle it further, I approached the oak tree. The creature shrieked and bared its teeth, but it was well and truly stuck in the vines. Heart pounding, I reached out and managed to grab hold of one of its arms. Its skin felt leathery and hot to the touch. With my other hand, I started untangling the vines wrapped around its legs. The whole time it thrashed and bit at my hands, but its teeth weren't sharp enough to break the skin. Finally, I got it free and lifted the squirming creature into the air. It couldn't have weighed more than 15 or 20 pounds. Up close, the human-like qualities of its face were even more apparent and unsettling. Those eyes seemed far too intelligent for a mere animal. I had no idea what to do next. I couldn't just let this thing go. Who would believe me if I told them what I'd seen? And what if it was dangerous? I had to bring it back and show others. Keeping a firm grip on the still shrieking creature, I made my way back to where I'd left my supplies. I emptied out my canvas rucksack and managed to stuff the little beast inside, cinching it tight so it couldn't escape. Its cries were muffled, but I could feel it squirming and clawing inside the bag. The walk back to town was nerve-wracking. Every rustle in the trees made me jump. I kept expecting to be ambushed by more of these creatures, or for the one in my bag to somehow break free. But nothing happened, and I made it back without incident. I went straight to the sheriff's office, my hands shaking as I explained to the deputy what had happened. At first he thought I was drunk or pulling his leg, but when I opened the bag and dumped the creature out onto his desk, his jaw dropped. Word spread quickly through our small town. Within an hour, it seemed like half of Waldoboro had crowded into the sheriff's office to gawk at my strange captive. Folks were shouting all sorts of theories about what it could be, everything from a deformed child to a demon to an alien. The creature itself had gone quiet, huddled in the corner of a wooden crate we'd put it in. It watched us all with those unnerving eyes, occasionally letting out a soft whimper. I felt a twinge of guilt seeing it so scared, but I pushed the feeling aside. This was too important of a discovery to ignore. Over the next few days, word of the capture spread far and wide. Reporters from Portland and even Boston showed up to see the Waldoboro Devil, as some had taken to calling it. A professor from a university came to examine it, prodding and measuring while the creature shrieked in protest. Privately, the professor told me he believed it to be some unknown species of primate, possibly a juvenile, but publicly he was more cautious, not wanting to stake his reputation on such an outlandish claim. I started having doubts about whether I'd done the right thing. The creature was clearly terrified, barely eating and spending most of its time huddled in a corner of its cage. But I told myself it was too late to change course now. About a week after the capture, I woke in the middle of the night to a commotion outside. I threw on some clothes and ran out to find a crowd gathered around the shed where we'd been keeping the creature. The door was wide open, the lock broken. Inside, the cage was empty. There were no signs of how it escaped. The bars weren't bent, and the door was still locked. It was as if the creature had simply vanished into thin air. We searched the woods for days, but found no trace. Slowly, life in Waldoboro returned to normal. Folks still talked about the incident, but with each retelling, the details got more exaggerated and muddled. Some said I'd made the whole thing up for attention. Others insisted it had been a hoax or a deformed human child. But I know what I saw. That creature was real, and there was nothing human about it. To this day, I sometimes wake up in a cold sweat, remembering those intelligent eyes staring at me. And on quiet nights, I could swear I hear faint, high-pitched shrieks echoing from deep in the forest. Whatever that creature was, I don't think it was alone out there. And I can't shake the feeling that someday, somehow, they'll make their presence known again. I just hope we're ready when they do. Story 2. It was late October, and I had joined a small expedition led by an experienced local guide named Mikhail. There were 5 of us total, myself, Mikhail, and 3 other hunters from various parts of Russia. We had ventured deep into the wilderness, far from any towns or villages. The landscape was rugged and beautiful, with dense pine forests and craggy mountains looming in the distance. On our 3rd day out, we made camp near a secluded valley. As dusk fell, Mikhail gathered us around the fire and began telling old legends about the area. He spoke of strange creatures that were said to roam these forests, beings that were neither human nor animal, but something in between. I listened with mild interest, but didn't put much stock in the tales. If only I had known then how terrifyingly real they would turn out to be. That night, I was awoken by an unsettling sound echoing through the trees. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, a low, guttural moan that sent chills down my spine. I peered out of my tent, but saw nothing in the inky darkness. Eventually the noise faded, and I drifted back into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, we set out to do some hunting. Mikhail led us to a promising area where he said large game was often spotted. As we crept silently through the underbrush, I had an eerie feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I tried to shake it off as nerves, but the sensation persisted. Suddenly, one of the other hunters let out a startled yelp. We all spun around to see what had spooked him. There, partially hidden behind a massive pine tree, was a towering figure unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but stood at least 7 feet tall. Its body was covered in thick, dark fur, but it was the face that filled me with terror. Instead of normal human features, it had what looked like a single large eye in the center of its forehead, with another smaller eye bizarrely positioned on its cheek. For a moment, we all stood frozen in shock. Then the creature let out that same bone-chilling moan I'd heard the night before. Panic set in, and we scattered, running blindly through the forest. I could hear heavy footsteps pursuing us, branches snapping as the thing crashed through the woods behind us. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, my heart pounding in my ears. I glanced back over my shoulder and caught a glimpse of the monster gaining on us. Its gait was strange and loping, and I realized with horror that its feet seemed to lack toes, ending instead in sharp, pointed heels that dug into the earth as it ran. One of the other hunters, a man named Alexei, stumbled and fell. I heard his terrified scream cut short as the creature reached him. I wanted desperately to help, but fear propelled me forward. Eventually, I reached a small clearing where Mikhail and the others had regrouped. We were all gasping for breath, eyes wild with fear. What was that thing? I managed to choke out between ragged breaths. Mikhail's face was grave. An ancient evil that dwells in these forests. I had hoped the old stories were just legends, but now I fear they are all too real. We knew we had to go back for Alexei, or at least recover his body. Arming ourselves with our hunting rifles, we cautiously retraced our path. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet now, with no signs of wildlife. An oppressive silence hung in the air. We found Alexei's body in a small gully. The sight was horrific. His chest had been torn open, ribs shattered. But what struck me as most bizarre was the pool of dark fluid surrounding the corpse. It was too thick and viscous to be normal blood. As we stood there in stunned silence, we heard that chilling moan again, much closer this time. Without a word, we all raised our rifles and formed a defensive circle. Moments later, the creature emerged from the trees. In the daylight, I could see it more clearly now. Its fur was a rich sable color, and its skin underneath was thick and leathery. Those misshapen eyes swiveled independently, taking us all in. What happened next is still a blur. There was a cacophony of gunshots as we all opened fire. The monster roared in pain and rage. I saw bullets tear into its hide, dark fluid spraying from the wounds, but it kept coming, barreling towards us with terrifying speed. In desperation, I aimed for one of its eyes and squeezed the trigger. My shot found its mark, and the creature stumbled, howling. It thrashed about wildly, smashing trees and vegetation. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, it collapsed to the ground with a thunderous impact. We approached the fallen monster cautiously, rifles still trained on it. Up close, its alien nature was even more apparent. The skin was unlike any animal hide I'd ever seen, almost reptilian in texture. And that bizarre eye placement. I still can't fathom the evolutionary purpose behind such a trait. Mikhail instructed us to gather wood to burn the carcass. He said it was vital that no evidence of the creature remain. As the flames consumed the body, an acrid stench filled the air. We stood watch until nothing was left but ashes, which we then scattered. The rest of that day passed in a daze as we hiked back to civilization. We were all deeply shaken by what we had experienced. When we finally reached the nearest village, Mikhail warned us not to speak of what had happened. He said the locals would not take kindly to outsiders spreading tales of the forest demon. Sure enough, when we tried to explain to the village elders why we had returned early from our expedition, they grew cold and evasive. They refused to acknowledge the existence of any monsters in the region and seemed eager for us to leave. It was clear they were hiding something, protecting some ancient secret. In the year since that fateful hunting trip, I've struggled to make sense of what we encountered. I've researched cryptozoology and obscure folklore, trying to find any references to similar creatures. But nothing quite matches what we saw that day in the Russian wilderness. The experience has shaken my entire worldview. I now know there are things in this world that defy scientific explanation, entities that lurk in the shadows of remote places, defying our understanding of biology and evolution. I still have nightmares about those misshapen eyes and that otherworldly moan echoing through the trees. Sometimes I wonder if we did the right thing by destroying the evidence. Part of me wishes we had preserved the body for study, but a larger part is relieved that no trace remains. There are some mysteries that are perhaps better left unsolved, some truths that mankind is not yet ready to face. I don't know if I'll ever fully come to terms with what happened in those woods. The rational part of my mind still struggles to accept it. But I know what I saw. I know the terror I felt. And I know that somewhere out there, in the vast wilderness of the world, more of those creatures may still exist, waiting, watching, hidden from the eyes of modern civilization. I can only hope that they remain undiscovered, for I fear that if humanity ever truly became aware of such beings, it would shatter our perception of reality itself. Some secrets are meant to stay buried in the dark forests of the world, never to see the light of day. And after what I experienced, I'm content to leave them there. Story 3. I was out hunting with my buddies in the Arkansas backcountry last fall, when we had an encounter that still gives me chills thinking about it. We'd been tracking deer all day without much luck, so as evening approached, we decided to set up camp near a small clearing in the woods. As we sat around the campfire, swapping stories and sipping whiskey, I had this uneasy feeling like we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder into the darkness beyond our little circle of firelight, but couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. Suddenly, we heard a loud crash coming from the trees, like something big moving through the underbrush. We all froze, straining our ears. There was an eerie silence for a few moments, then another crash, closer this time. "What the hell was that?" whispered Joe, reaching for his rifle. Before anyone could answer, we heard a bone-chilling howl echoing through the forest. It started low and guttural, then rose to a high-pitched wail that made my blood run cold. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard before, not quite human, but not quite beast either. We scrambled to our feet, grabbing our weapons. I clicked on my flashlight and swept the beam across the tree line. For a split second I caught a glimpse of movement, something massive and dark darting between the trees. "Did you see that?" I hissed. The others nodded, eyes wide with fear. Another howl split the night, so close it made my ears ring. Then we heard heavy footsteps circling our camp, just beyond the reach of the firelight. Whatever it was big, really big. Suddenly, it burst into the clearing. In the flickering firelight, I caught a glimpse of matted fur, impossibly long arms, and glowing eyes reflecting the flames. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, barrel-chested and powerfully built. For a moment, we all stood frozen in shock. Then it let out another ear-splitting howl and charged straight at us. Panic set in and we scattered, running blindly into the dark forest. I could hear its heavy footfalls right behind me as I crashed through the underbrush. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature was gaining on me, moving with unnatural speed and agility for something so large. In the beam of my bouncing flashlight, I caught flashes of matted fur and bared teeth. Suddenly, my foot caught on a root, and I went sprawling. I hit the ground hard, knocking the wind out of me. As I scrambled to get up, I felt hot breath on the back of my neck. Slowly, I turned to face the monster looming over me. Up close, the stench was overwhelming. A mixture of wet dog, rotting meat, and something distinctly musky and wild. Its face was almost human-like, with a flattened nose and deep-set eyes glinting with intelligence. But the mouth was filled with pointed teeth, lips pulled back in a snarl. I was certain I was about to die. But just as the creature reached for me with massive clawed hands, a gunshot rang out. The monster reared back with an agonized roar. More shots followed in rapid succession. My buddies had circled back when they realized I wasn't with them. Joe was unloading his rifle into the beast, while the others shouted and waved their flashlights, trying to scare it off. With a final bone-chilling howl, the creature turned and loped off into the forest, melting into the shadows like a nightmare fading in the light of day. We didn't stick around to see if it would come back. We hightailed it out of there as fast as we could, not stopping until we reached Joe's truck parked on a logging road miles away. The whole drive back to town, we barely spoke. What the hell had we just encountered? It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. Some kind of missing link between man and beast. A real-life monster straight out of a horror movie. When we got back to civilization, we debated whether to report what happened. In the end, we decided against it. Who would believe us anyway? They'd probably just think we were drunk or on drugs. But I know what I saw that night. And in the months since, I've done some research. Turns out there have been other sightings of similar creatures in that area going back decades. The locals call them wild men or wood apes. Some say they're just misidentified bears. Others think they could be some undiscovered primate species. A few even believe they're some kind of alien or interdimensional being. I don't know what to think anymore. All I know is that I'll never forget that night in the Arkansas woods. The memory of those glowing eyes and that unearthly howl still haunts my dreams. I used to scoff at stories of Bigfoot and other cryptids. Now, I'm not so sure. There are things out there in the dark forests of this world that defy explanation. Things that maybe we're not meant to understand. I haven't been back to those woods since that night. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the quiet darkness, I swear I can still hear that howl echoing in the distance, and I wonder, is it out there still? Watching, waiting, ready to emerge from the shadows once again. Whatever it was, that encounter changed me, made me realize how little we truly know about the world around us. There are mysteries out there, and dangers we can't begin to comprehend. So next time you're in the wilderness and get that prickly feeling of being watched, pay attention, because you never know what might be lurking just beyond the firelight, waiting to step out of legend and into reality. Story 4. The property was perfect, a cozy farmhouse surrounded by dense woods with plenty of privacy. At first, I loved the peace and quiet. But that all changed over the course of 3 terrifying nights that I'll never forget. It was a sweltering summer, and I remember tossing and turning in bed, unable to sleep in the oppressive heat. My bedroom window was wide open, hoping to catch any hint of a breeze. It must have been around 2 a.m. when I first heard it, a blood-curdling scream coming from the woods behind my house. I bolted upright, my heart pounding. It wasn't like any animal sound I'd ever heard before. It was loud, so loud it seemed to shake the whole house, and it sounded almost human, but not quite. There was a guttural, primal quality to it that sent chills down my spine. I stumbled to the window, peering out into the inky darkness. The screams continued, seeming to move through the trees. Whatever was making that sound had to be massive. I could hear branches snapping and the ground shaking slightly with each of its movements. I was paralyzed with fear, unsure what to do. Should I call the police? Would they even believe me? The screaming went on for what felt like hours, though in reality it was probably closer to 90 minutes. Finally, around 3:30 a.m., everything went eerily silent. I barely slept the rest of the night, convinced that at any moment the creature would burst through my door. When morning came, I tried to convince myself it had all been a vivid nightmare. But deep down, I knew what I'd heard was real. The next night, I was determined to stay awake and alert. I made a strong pot of coffee and settled into the living room with all the lights on. Sure enough, at almost the exact same time, the screams began again. This time, I forced myself to listen more closely. There was a rhythmic pattern to the vocalizations, almost like speech, but in no language I'd ever heard. It would start with a low, rumbling growl that built to a piercing shriek. then a series of whooping calls that echoed through the trees. I found myself transfixed by the sounds, both terrified and oddly fascinated. What kind of creature could make noises like that? It certainly wasn't a bear or mountain lion or any other animal native to Massachusetts. Again, the screaming continued for about 90 minutes before abruptly stopping. I was rattled to my core, but also frustrated by my inability to see anything. I decided that if it happened again the next night, I would try to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. The third night, I was ready. I'd installed powerful floodlights on my roof earlier that day, pointed towards the woods. I sat vigil by the window, every nerve on edge. Like clockwork, the screams began just after 2 a.m. My hands shaking, I flipped the switch to turn on the floodlights. For a split second I saw it, a massive dark shape moving through the trees. It must have been at least 8 feet tall, covered in what looked like thick, matted fur. The sudden brightness startled the creature. It let out a deafening roar that made my windows rattle, then turned and crashed away through the forest. The ground trembled under its footsteps as it fled. I sank to the floor, my mind reeling. What had I just seen? It couldn't be real, and yet I knew it was. I just had an encounter with something that shouldn't exist. The next morning, still shaken, I worked up the courage to venture into the woods. The area where I'd seen the creature was a mess of broken branches and trampled vegetation, and there, pressed into a muddy patch of ground, was a footprint bigger than any I'd ever seen. It was over 15 inches long, with clear toe impressions. I took some shaky photos, but in my panicked state, they didn't come out very clear. Later that day, my next-door neighbor came by. "Did you hear those weird noises last night?" she asked. "Sounded like it was coming from your property. Scared the daylights out of me and my husband." I was simultaneously relieved and unnerved to have my experience confirmed by someone else. I carefully asked if she'd seen anything, but she said no. They'd been too frightened to look outside. I debated whether to report what had happened, but ultimately decided against it. Who would believe me? I'd be labeled as the neighborhood crackpot. So I kept quiet, but I never forgot. Years passed, and I eventually moved away from that house. But the memory of those 3 nights stayed with me. I'd occasionally hear stories of Bigfoot sightings and wonder if that's what I'd encountered, but I was never sure. Then, about a decade later, I was watching a documentary about Bigfoot. They played an audio recording of alleged Bigfoot vocalizations, and I felt the blood drain from my face. The sounds were identical to what I'd heard all those years ago. The same rhythmic patterns, the same blend of human-like and animal qualities. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty what I'd experienced. I'd had a close encounter with a Bigfoot, right in my own backyard in suburban Massachusetts. To this day, I still struggle to fully process what happened. It goes against everything I thought I knew about the world. But I know what I heard, and I know what I saw. Something unexplainable was in those woods, something that science says shouldn't exist. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, there are times I can barely believe it myself. But I know it happened, and I often wonder, is that creature still out there somewhere? Are there others like it? The thought both terrifies and fascinates me. One thing's for certain, I'll never forget those summer nights in 1979, when the impossible became real and my entire worldview was shattered. It's a reminder that there are still mysteries in this world, things beyond our understanding. And sometimes those mysteries come screaming into our lives when we least expect it. Story 5. It was early October, perfect weather for bow hunting. I'd been out since dawn, moving quietly through the forest. The leaves were just starting to turn, creating a kaleidoscope of reds and golds. As the morning wore on, I found myself in a remote area I didn't visit often, a mix of dense woodland and marshy lowlands. Around 10 a.m., I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. At first I thought it was a bear. We get plenty of those around here. But as I turned to look, I realized this was something else entirely. Something I'd never seen before. It was massive. I'd estimate 400, 500 pounds easy. But the size wasn't what shocked me. It was everything else about this creature. It stood upright on two legs, towering at least 7 feet tall. The body was covered in the strangest fur I'd ever seen, sleek and shiny like a horse's coat, but a striking silvery grey colour. I froze in place, heart pounding. The thing hadn't noticed me yet. It was maybe 50 yards away, partially obscured by brush. I could see its profile as it seemed to be foraging or searching for something on the ground. The head is what I remember most vividly. It had a sloping forehead, somewhere between a bear and an ape. But the eyes, God, the eyes. They were a reddish-brown colour, almost like a rooster's eyes, and seemed to glow with an unnatural intelligence. I must have made some small sound, because suddenly its head snapped in my direction. For a split second, our eyes met. A jolt of primal fear shot through me, unlike anything I'd ever felt. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I didn't. I couldn't move. We just stared at each other, frozen in a moment that felt like it stretched for hours. Its gaze was unnervingly human-like. I had the overwhelming sense that this thing was studying me, evaluating me. Then, in a burst of movement almost too fast to follow, it turned and crashed off into the underbrush. The spell was broken. I stumbled backwards, nearly falling over myself in my haste to get away. I'm not ashamed to admit I practically ran all the way back to my truck. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. I peeled out of there, spraying gravel, mind reeling as I tried to process what I'd just seen. When I got home, my wife took one look at me and knew something was wrong. She said later that I was white as a sheet, looked like I'd seen a ghost. I couldn't even speak at first, just collapsed into a chair at the kitchen table. "What happened?" she kept asking. "Are you hurt? Should I call someone?" I shook my head, tried to collect myself. "I'm fine," I managed to croak out. "Just saw something out there. Something I can't explain." She poured me a stiff drink and I gulped it down, feeling the burn of whiskey steady my nerves a bit. Haltingly, I told her what I'd seen. To her credit, she didn't laugh or tell me I was crazy. She just listened, eyes wide. "Maybe it was just a bear," she suggested gently when I finished. "You said yourself it was partially hidden. Could have been a trick of the light, your eyes playing tricks." I shook my head vehemently. "I know what I saw. This wasn't any damn bear." We went back and forth like that for a while. Part of me wanted to believe her rational explanations, but I couldn't shake the memory of those eyes, the intelligence in them, the way it had moved, so fast, so fluid. No bear moves like that. I barely slept that night, kept replaying the encounter in my head, questioning my own senses. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I had to go back, had to know for sure I wasn't going crazy. This time, I brought my 2 hunting dogs, figured their noses might pick up a scent if there was anything to find. It was a long shot, but I had to try something. We returned to the general area where I'd had the encounter. The dogs seemed on edge from the start, whining and sticking close to my legs instead of ranging out like usual. That alone made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. For hours we searched, working our way deeper into the boggy lowlands. The dogs would occasionally catch a scent and get excited, only to lose it again. It was maddening. Finally, near a particularly swampy area, they went nuts. Baying and howling like I'd never heard before, they took off into the muck, me slogging after them as fast as I could. But it was like the trail just ended. One minute the dogs were in a frenzy, the next they were milling around confused, whimpering. No tracks, no scent, nothing. It was like whatever they'd been chasing had simply vanished into thin air. That's when I noticed how quiet it had gotten. No birds, no insects, just an eerie stillness. The hairs on my arms stood up. I had the overwhelming feeling we were being watched. A twig snapped somewhere in the gloom of the swamp. The dogs started growling, hackles raised. I didn't stick around to see what it was. I called the dogs and we got out of there quick. That was the last time I went looking. Oh, I've been back in those woods plenty since then, but never to that specific area. Call it superstition, call it cowardice. I don't care. Some things are better left alone. I've turned it over in my mind 1,000 times since that day, tried to rationalize it, explain it away, but I know what I saw, what I felt. It was real. I've heard stories since then, whispered accounts of other sightings in the area over the years. Most folks are hesitant to talk about it openly. Around here you don't want to get a reputation as the local crazy, but sometimes over beers at the lodge, other hunters will quietly share their own strange experiences, a glimpse of something unexplainable, weird tracks, unsettling noises in the night. It's comforting in a way to know I'm not alone. I don't know what's out there in those woods. Maybe it's some undiscovered species, maybe it's something else. All I know is it changed me, made me realize how little we truly understand about the world around us. I still hunt, still love being out in nature, but I'm more cautious now, more aware. And sometimes, when I'm deep in the backcountry, I'll catch myself scanning the tree line, wondering if I'll ever see those eyes again. Part of me hopes I do. Part of me prays I never will. Story 6. I was stationed at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard back in the spring of 1990, doing my reserve duty with the Navy. It was a pretty typical weekend. We'd finished up our exercises for the day, and I was looking forward to spending some time with my girlfriend, showing her around the area. I'd been telling her about this cool old quarry I'd stumbled across during one of our training exercises, so we decided to drive out there that evening. It was getting on towards dusk as we headed down this winding back road in York County. The trees were just starting to bud, and there was still a bit of a chill in the air. I remember thinking how peaceful it all looked, the fading light filtering through the branches, casting long shadows across the pavement. We pulled off onto a little dirt track that led towards the quarry. I killed the engine, and we just sat there for a minute, taking in the quiet. That's when I noticed something moving at the edge of the tree line, maybe 50 yards away. At first, I thought it was a moose. We'd seen a few in the area before, but as I focused on it, I realized the shape was all wrong. It was too tall, too human-like. I leaned forward, squinting to get a better look. That's when this feeling of absolute terror just slammed into me out of nowhere. My heart started racing, and I broke out in a cold sweat. I've been in some tense situations before, but I'd never felt anything like this. It was like every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get the hell out of there. I fumbled for the keys, my hands shaking so bad I could barely get them in the ignition. My girlfriend was asking what was wrong, but I couldn't even form words. I just knew we had to leave. Now. As I cranked the engine, I caught another glimpse of the thing. It was moving fast, way faster than any person could run. In the fading light, all I could make out was this reddish-orange blur streaking through the underbrush. It had to be at least 6 feet tall, maybe more. I threw the car in reverse and peeled out of there, tires kicking up gravel. My girlfriend was yelling at me to slow down, but I couldn't. That sense of urgency, of mortal danger, was overwhelming. I didn't feel safe until we were miles away, back on the main road with other cars around. When I finally calmed down enough to talk, I tried to explain what I'd seen. But how do you describe something like that? I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head, and I still can't make sense of it. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a moose, wasn't anything I'd ever encountered before. And that feeling of terror. I've never experienced anything like it, before or since. For weeks afterwards, I had trouble sleeping. I'd jerk awake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced I'd heard something moving outside my window. During the day, I'd catch myself scanning the tree line any time I was outdoors, half expecting to see that reddish blur again. I tried talking to a few of the guys in my unit about it, but they just laughed it off, said I'd been watching too many horror movies. My girlfriend was more understanding, but I could tell she thought I was exaggerating or had just spooked myself somehow. But I know what I saw. And more than that, I know what I felt. That primal fear isn't something you can fake or imagine. It was real, and it was triggered by something out there in those woods. I've done some research since then, trying to find any similar reports from the area. There have been a few scattered accounts of strange sightings in the forests of Maine, but nothing that exactly matches what I experienced. Some people have suggested it might have been a Bigfoot or some other cryptid, but I'm not sure I buy into all that. All I know is that something was out there that night, something that didn't belong in our world, that set off every alarm bell in my lizard brain, and the worst part is not knowing what it was, where it came from, or if it's still out there. I've never gone back to that quarry, haven't even driven down that road again. Part of me wants to prove to myself that it was all in my head, that there's a logical explanation. But every time I think about it, that same feeling of dread washes over me. It's like my body remembers the danger, even if my mind can't fully comprehend it. Sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I find myself wondering about that thing. Was it just passing through, or does it live in those woods? Has anyone else seen it? And what would have happened if we'd stayed there just a few minutes longer? I don't have any answers. All I have is the memory of those few terrifying moments burned into my brain like a brand, the flash of reddish-orange through the trees, the impossible speed of its movement, and that overwhelming, inexplicable fear. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Maybe it was just the light playing tricks on my eyes. Maybe I was more stressed from the military exercises than I realized, and my mind conjured up some threat that wasn't really there. But deep down, I know that's not true. Whatever I saw that day was real, and it was something beyond my understanding. I've never told this story publicly before. For a long time, I was afraid people would think I was crazy or attention-seeking. But recently, I've started to feel like I need to share this experience, not to convince anyone or to seek validation, but because keeping it bottled up for so long has been its own kind of burden. So here it is, my story, for whatever it's worth. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, there are days I barely believe it myself. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I know that there are things out there in the dark that we can't explain, things that defy our understanding of the world. To this day, I can't see a flash of orange-red without my heart skipping a beat. I can't hear a twig snap in the woods without tensing up, ready to run. That encounter, brief as it was, changed something fundamental in me. It opened my eyes to the possibility that the world is stranger and more dangerous than we want to believe. I don't know if I'll ever fully come to terms with what happened that spring evening in 1990. But I do know this. There are things out there in the wilderness, in the shadows between the trees, that we can't explain. Things that don't fit into our neat, orderly view of the world. And sometimes, if we're not careful, we might just catch a glimpse of them. So, if you're ever driving down a lonely back road in Maine and you see something moving at the edge of your vision, something that doesn't quite look right, don't stop to investigate. Don't try to get a closer look. Just keep driving, because some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some creatures are better left unseen. Story 7. We arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon. Dad and my older brother Jake set up the tents while Mom and I got the fishing gear ready. Everything seemed normal at first. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine. Birds were chirping, and a light breeze rustled through the trees. It was idyllic, the kind of place where you'd never expect anything bad to happen. As the sun started to set, we headed down to the shore to do some evening fishing. That's when things started to feel off. I can't explain it, but there was suddenly this heavy feeling in the air, like the whole forest was holding its breath. The birds had gone quiet, and even the insects seemed to have stopped buzzing. Then we heard it, a sound that still sends chills down my spine when I think about it. It started as a high-pitched screech, almost like a bird of prey, but then it changed. It morphed into something that sounded like a hyena's laugh, but deeper, more guttural. It echoed through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. We all froze, looking at each other with wide eyes. Dad tried to play it cool, saying it was probably just some weird bird or maybe a fox, but I could see the worry in his eyes. He suggested we head back to the campsite, just to be safe. As we were packing up our gear, I overheard Dad talking to Mom in hushed tones. He mentioned something about a local fishing guide who had reported seeing a giant hairy figure in these woods a few weeks back. My heart started racing. I'd heard stories about Bigfoot, but I'd always thought they were just that, stories. Back at the campsite, we built a fire and tried to act normal, but there was this tension in the air that wouldn't go away. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made us all jump. I kept thinking I saw shadows moving just beyond the firelight, but when I looked closer, there was nothing there. As night fell, things got worse. The screams started again, but this time they were louder, more intense. They seemed to be coming from different directions, as if whatever was making them was circling our camp. Sometimes they sounded far away, and then suddenly they'd be so close it felt like they were right outside our tents. I remember huddling in the tent with Jake, both of us too scared to even whisper. We could hear Mom and Dad outside, talking in urgent, frightened tones. I wanted to run, to get in the car and drive away as fast as we could. But we were miles from the nearest town, and the thought of trying to navigate those dark forest roads was almost as terrifying as staying put. The night seemed to stretch on forever. None of us slept. We just sat there, listening to those horrible screams, wondering what kind of creature could make such ungodly noises. At one point, I swear I heard heavy footsteps right outside our tent. Something big was out there, moving around our campsite. Just before dawn, there was a moment of absolute silence. The screams stopped, the footsteps disappeared. For a second I thought maybe it was over, but then we heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground. It was so deep, so primal, that it made my whole body shake with fear. That was it for Dad. As soon as there was enough light to see, he told us to pack up. We've never moved so fast in our lives. We threw everything into the car, not even bothering to take down the tents properly. As we drove away, I looked back at our campsite. For a split second, I thought I saw something, a massive dark shape standing at the edge of the clearing. But then we rounded a bend in the road, and it was gone. The drive home was silent. We were all trying to process what had happened, to make sense of it. But how do you rationalize something like that? How do you explain sounds that shouldn't exist, or the feeling of being watched by something that shouldn't be real? It's been years now, and I still don't have answers. I've tried researching, looking for similar experiences or explanations for what we heard that night, but nothing quite fits. Sometimes I wonder if it was all just some elaborate prank, or if our fears just got the better of us. But then I remember that growl, that feeling of absolute terror, and I know it was real. We never went back to Prong Pond after that. Dad sold all our fishing gear, and we stopped going on camping trips altogether. It's like we all made an unspoken agreement to never talk about what happened, but I can't forget. I still have nightmares sometimes, where I'm back in that tent, listening to those screams getting closer and closer. I don't know what was out there in the woods that night. Maybe it was Bigfoot, maybe it was something else entirely. All I know is that it changed me. It showed me that there are things in this world that we can't explain, things that defy our understanding of what's possible. And sometimes ignorance really is bliss, because once you've heard those screams, once you've felt that primal fear, you can never truly feel safe in the woods again. I'm sharing this now because I need to get it off my chest. For years, I've carried this experience alone, afraid that people would think I was crazy if I told them. But I know what I heard, what I felt. And if anyone else has had a similar experience, I want them to know they're not alone. There are things out there, in the dark corners of the world, that we can't explain. And sometimes, the best we can do is acknowledge their existence and hope we never cross paths with them again. Story 8. I was driving down a dirt road in Oxford County, Maine, with my wife and 2 kids on July 3rd, 1998. It was late afternoon, and we were heading back from a day trip to the lake. The kids were tired and quiet in the back seat. My wife and I were chatting about plans for the 4th of July barbecue we were hosting the next day. Suddenly, I saw something step out onto the road ahead of us. At first, I thought it was a person, but as we got closer, I realized it was way too tall to be human. This thing had to be at least 8 feet tall. It was incredibly thin and lanky, with long brown hair covering its entire body. I slowed the truck down, not sure what to do. As we got closer, I could make out more details. The creature was walking on 2 legs, but its gait was strange. It took huge strides, covering an unnatural amount of ground with each step. Its arms were extremely long, hanging down past its knees. My wife gasped and grabbed my arm. "What is that thing?" she whispered. I shook my head, at a loss for words. The kids hadn't noticed yet, still distracted by their handheld video games in the back seat. I was glad for that. I didn't want to frighten them. As we approached, I expected the creature to run, or at least react to our presence. But it just kept walking across the road at that same steady pace, not even glancing our way. It was surreal, like we weren't even there. In a matter of seconds, it had crossed the road and disappeared into the thick forest on the other side. I brought the truck to a stop where it had crossed, and my wife and I just stared at each other in shock. Did you see that?" I asked shakily. She nodded, her eyes wide. "What was it?" she whispered. "It looked like Bigfoot," I finished for her. It sounded crazy to say out loud, but there was no other way to describe what we'd just witnessed. We sat there for a few moments, trying to process what had happened. Part of me wanted to get out and look for tracks, but a larger part just wanted to get my family home safely. "Daddy, why'd we stop?" My daughter piped up from the back seat. I cleared my throat. "Oh, just thought I saw a deer," I lied. My wife and I exchanged a look, silently agreeing not to mention this to the kids. I put the truck back in drive and we continued on our way home. But I couldn't stop replaying the encounter in my mind. The creature's impossible height and proportions, the way it moved with those huge strides, and strangest of all, how it seemed completely oblivious to our presence. When we got home, I tried to go about our normal routine, but I felt shaken. After we put the kids to bed, my wife and I finally had a chance to discuss what we'd seen. "It was real, right?" she asked. "We both saw it?" I nodded. "It was real. I've never seen anything like it in my life." We debated whether to report it, but who would believe us? We had no proof, just our word. And I didn't want my family to become the subject of ridicule or unwanted attention, so we decided to keep it to ourselves, at least for the time being. But neither of us could stop thinking about it. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that tall, hairy figure striding across the road. I kept wondering, where had it come from? Where was it going? Were there more of them out there? The next morning, I woke up early and drove back out to the spot where we'd had the encounter. I searched the area thoroughly, looking for any sign of the creature's passage. Tracks, hair, anything. But the ground was dry and hard-packed. If there had been prints, they were long gone now. I did find one thing, though. About 20 feet into the woods on the side where the creature had emerged, there was a small clearing, and in that clearing was a strange arrangement of sticks and branches, formed into a kind of crude structure. It was about 7 feet tall, with a domed top. I'd never seen anything like it before. My mind raced, wondering if the creature had built this. Was it some kind of shelter, a marker? I took some photos with my disposable camera, but when I got them developed later, they just looked like a jumble of sticks, nothing to prove what I'd seen. As the days and weeks passed, I became obsessed with researching Bigfoot sightings and theories. I scoured books and websites, looking for anything that matched what we'd seen. There were similar reports from the area over the years, but nothing quite like our encounter. I started going for long hikes in the woods, hoping to catch another glimpse of the creature. My wife worried about me, said I was becoming too fixated on it. But I couldn't let it go. I needed answers. One night, about a month after the sighting, I was out in the woods near dusk. I'd hiked further than usual, caught up in my thoughts. Suddenly I heard a strange sound echoing through the trees. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, a cross between a howl and a scream, but more guttural and primal. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Then I heard something large moving through the underbrush nearby. Panic gripped me as I realized how far I was from my truck, how dark it was getting. I turned and ran, branches whipping my face as I crashed through the forest. I made it back to my vehicle, heart pounding. As I fumbled for my keys, I heard that eerie howl again, closer this time. I peeled out of there as fast as I could. When I got home, my wife took one look at my scratched face and wild eyes and knew something had happened. I told her everything. She listened patiently, then said, "I think this has gone far enough. You're scaring me, and you're going to end up getting hurt if you keep this up." I knew she was right. My obsession was taking over my life, affecting my work and my family. I agreed to stop the research, the hikes, all of it. It wasn't easy. For months afterward, I'd find myself staring out into the woods, wondering. Every unexplained sound in the night made me tense up. But gradually, life returned to normal. We never told anyone about what we'd seen that day. Years have passed now. My kids are grown, off to college. My wife and I still live in the same house, but we don't talk about that summer day in 1998 anymore. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, but then I'll catch my wife gazing out at the tree line with a faraway look in her eyes, and I know she remembers too. I don't know what we saw out there on that dirt road. I can't explain it, but I know it was real, and it changed me forever. There are things in this world beyond our understanding. I just hope that whatever it was, it's still out there somewhere, striding through the forests of Maine with those impossibly long steps, free and wild and mysterious. Story 9. Around 11 p.m., I was driving slowly down a residential street when suddenly the back of my car lurched upward. The whole vehicle shook violently for a moment. My heart nearly stopped. What the hell was that? I slammed on the brakes and fumbled for the spotlight, my hands shaking. As I swung the beam of light around behind the car, I caught a glimpse of something massive and furry disappearing between two houses. It was walking on two legs, but it sure as hell wasn't human. The sight of it made my blood run cold. I radioed it in immediately, my voice cracking as I tried to describe what I'd seen. Within minutes, more units started converging on the area. State police, local cops, K-9 units, they all came flooding in. The quiet night erupted into a frenzy of flashing lights and radio chatter. We began a search pattern, combing through yards and wooded areas. As we searched, reports started coming in from all over the county. Farmers calling about mutilated livestock, Terrified homeowners spotting a huge, hairy creature in their yards. This thing, whatever it was, seemed to be all over the place. I joined up with a group of officers to search a heavily wooded area on the outskirts of town. We had our weapons drawn, powerful flashlights sweeping back and forth through the trees. The darkness felt oppressive, like it was pressing in all around us. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves made us all jump. That's when we found the tracks. Huge, inhuman footprints pressed deep into the soft earth. They were easily 16 inches long, with strange claw marks at the ends of the toes. None of us had ever seen anything like it before. We followed the trail deeper into the woods, our nerves stretched to the breaking point. The farther we went, the more unsettling things became. We started finding tufts of coarse, reddish-brown fur snagged on tree branches. The stench of wet animal and something else, something rank and musty, hung heavy in the air. It was like nothing I'd ever smelled before, and it made my stomach churn. Suddenly, one of the K9 units started going crazy. The dog was straining at its leash, barking and growling like mad. Its handler could barely control it. We all raised our weapons, hearts pounding, as we tried to see what had set the dog off. That's when we heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was so deep I could feel it vibrating in my chest. Then came a series of sharp, high-pitched howls that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Whatever was making those sounds, it wasn't like any animal I'd ever encountered. We pressed on, deeper into the woods. The sounds seemed to be coming from just ahead of us, always staying just out of sight. We'd catch fleeting glimpses of movement through the trees, a flash of fur, the sound of heavy footsteps. But we could never quite catch up to it. As we pushed through a dense thicket, we suddenly broke into a small clearing. What we saw there stopped us all dead in our tracks. In the center of the clearing was the partially eaten carcass of a deer. But this was no normal predator kill. The deer had been ripped apart, its internal organs strewn about in a gruesome display. Long, deep claw marks scored the earth all around it. The sight and smell of it was overwhelming. One of the younger officers turned and vomited into the bushes. I'd seen plenty of ugly things in my years on the force, but nothing like this. It was like something out of a nightmare. We didn't have long to process what we were seeing. A deafening roar suddenly split the night air, coming from just beyond the tree line on the far side of the clearing. It was followed by the sound of something massive crashing through the underbrush, coming straight for us. Panic set in. We all opened fire, our gunshots echoing through the woods. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as we emptied our weapons into the trees. I caught a glimpse of something huge and dark hurtling towards us, but in the chaos, I couldn't make out any details. Just as suddenly as it started, everything went quiet. The creature, whatever it was, had vanished back into the woods. We stood there, panting and wild-eyed, straining to hear any sound of its return. But there was nothing, just the soft patter of spent shell casings hitting the forest floor. We radioed for backup and spent the rest of the night searching those woods. But we never found any sign of the creature again. No more tracks, no fur, nothing. It was like it had simply vanished into thin air. In the days that followed, the whole county was in an uproar. More sightings poured in, along with reports of missing pets and livestock. But despite an extensive search effort, no one ever managed to capture or clearly photograph the creature. To this day, I still don't know what we encountered in those woods. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before or since. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was just a bear, or maybe some kind of escaped exotic pet. But deep down, I know that's not true. Whatever that thing was, it was something else entirely. Something that shouldn't exist in our world. I've replayed that night in my head 1,000 times over the years. The sight of that massive, fur-covered form disappearing between houses, the inhuman footprints, those bone-chilling howls echoing through the darkness. the sheer savagery of that mutilated deer carcass. It all haunts me to this day. I'm not a superstitious man by nature. I've always tried to approach things rationally, to find logical explanations. But what happened that night in Plymouth County defies any rational explanation I can come up with. It shook my understanding of the world to its core. Sometimes on quiet nights, I still find myself peering out into the darkness, half expecting to see a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me. I keep my doors locked tight and a loaded gun close at hand, because deep down, I know that thing is still out there somewhere, and I can't shake the feeling that someday, somehow, I might encounter it again. I don't talk about that night much anymore. Most people don't believe me when I do. They think I'm just telling stories or that my memory has gotten fuzzy with age. But I know what I saw, what we all saw, and I'll carry those memories with me for the rest of my days. So if you're ever driving down a dark, lonely road in Plymouth County, keep your eyes open and your wits about you, because you never know what might be lurking in the shadows, waiting to pounce. Take it from someone who's been there. There are things in this world that defy explanation, and sometimes ignorance really is bliss. Story 10. We set out around 8 p.m., the cold winter air biting at our faces as we sped through the darkness. Our headlights cut through the inky black night, illuminating the snow-covered trees that whizzed by. We were having a blast, racing each other and pulling stunts. After about an hour of riding, we decided to take a break near this marshy area not far from some old train tracks. We killed the engines and just sat there for a bit, catching our breath and taking in the stillness of the night. That's when things got weird. I heard a rustling noise coming from the tree line about 50 yards away. At first I thought it was just a deer or something, but then I saw movement. Something big was moving through the trees. "Hey, Jake, you see that?" I whispered, nudging him and pointing towards the movement. He squinted into the darkness. "Yeah, what the hell is that?" Before either of us could say anything else, this massive shape emerged from the trees and stepped onto the path in front of us. I felt my blood run cold. This thing was huge. I mean, absolutely massive. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, probably closer to 8 or 9. And it was covered in thick, jet-black fur from head to toe. In 2 quick strides, it crossed the entire width of the path. Each step covered at least 6 feet. The raw power and speed of its movement was terrifying. Just before it disappeared into the trees on the other side, it turned and looked right at us. I'll never forget those eyes. They seemed to glow slightly in the darkness, reflecting our headlights. They were intelligent eyes, not like any animal I'd ever seen. For a split second, we locked eyes. A chill ran down my spine. Then in a flash, it was gone, vanishing silently into the woods. Jake and I just sat there in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Finally, Jake broke the silence. What the fuck was that?" His voice was shaky. I shook my head, trying to process what I'd just seen. I don't know, man. But it was real. We both saw it. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. We were just a couple of dumb kids who got spooked by a bear or something, right? But you have to understand, I'm not some city slicker who wouldn't know a bear from a buffalo. I grew up in these woods. I've been hunting since I was old enough to hold a rifle. I did 2 tours in Vietnam. I know what I saw. This thing was no bear. It moved on 2 legs with an almost human-like gait, but far more powerful. The intelligence in its eyes was unmistakable, and the sheer size of it. I've never seen anything like it before or since. We hightailed it out of there pretty quick after that. Didn't say much on the ride home, both of us lost in our own thoughts. I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd seen. Over the next few weeks, I found myself going back to that area, hoping to catch another glimpse or find some kind of evidence. I never saw the creature again, but I did notice some strange things. There were unusual tracks in the snow sometimes, huge human-like footprints that were way too big to belong to any person. And the wildlife in the area seemed off, like they were on edge all the time. But the weirdest thing was the sounds. At night, especially when it was really quiet, I'd hear these bizarre vocalizations echoing through the woods. They were like nothing I'd ever heard before, not quite human, not quite animal. Sometimes they sounded almost like cries or screams, other times more like howls or roars. The first time I heard them, maybe a week after our encounter, I nearly jumped out of my skin. I was out near the marsh again, foolishly hoping to see the creature. It was dead silent, not even the wind was blowing. Then suddenly, this haunting wail pierced the night. It started low and guttural, then rose to an almost shrieking pitch before fading away. I stood there frozen, every hair on my body standing on end. Then another cry answered the first, this one from a different direction. They went back and forth a few times before falling silent again. I hauled ass out of there, thoroughly freaked out. But over the next few months, I heard those sounds fairly regularly, always at night, always when I was alone out there. Sometimes closer, sometimes further away, but always chilling to the bone. I tried to record them a few times, but the sounds never came out clearly on tape. Just static and faint, garbled noises. It was beyond frustrating. I became a bit obsessed, I'll admit. Started researching similar encounters, looking into local folklore and history. Turns out there had been scattered reports over the years of a large, ape-like creature in the forests of Massachusetts. Most were dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications. But after what I saw, I knew better. I never told many people about what happened. Jake and I kind of had an unspoken agreement not to discuss it. When we did, he'd get all cagey and change the subject. I think it scared him more than he wanted to admit. The few times I did try to talk about it, people either thought I was crazy or making it up for attention. So eventually I just stopped bringing it up. But I never stopped thinking about it. Even now, over 40 years later, I can close my eyes and see that creature as clearly as if it were standing in front of me. The way it moved, the intelligence in its eyes, the raw power it exuded. It's seared into my memory. I still go out to those woods sometimes, though not as often as I used to. My knees aren't what they used to be. But every time I'm out there, I find myself scanning the tree line, straining my ears for any unusual sounds. Part of me hopes I'll see it again someday, get some answers to the questions that have plagued me all these years. But another part of me dreads the thought. What if it's not alone? What if there are more of them out there, watching us from the shadows? I don't know what that creature was. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, some unknown species. I can't say for sure. But I know what I saw that night. And I know that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk just beyond the edge of what we understand. So the next time you're out in the woods at night and you hear a strange sound or see a shadow move in a way it shouldn't, just remember, you might not be as alone out there as you think. Story 11. I'll never forget that day on Plum Island. It was April 13th, 1978, a date etched permanently in my memory. My friends and I had decided to take a day trip out to the island, thinking it would be a fun little adventure. We were all in our early 20s, carefree and looking for a bit of excitement. Little did we know the terror that awaited us. The day started out normal enough. We took the ferry over from Newburyport, laughing and joking around like we always did. The weather was nice for early spring, sunny but with a bit of a chill in the air. When we got to the island, we decided to hike out to one of the old observation towers left over from World War II. It seemed like it would offer a cool view of the coastline. As we approached the tower, that's when things started to feel off. The birds had gone quiet, and there was this heavy stillness in the air. At first I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. But then we started hearing these weird sounds echoing through the trees. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before. Loud, clicking noises interspersed with these short, high-pitched screams. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. We all kind of froze, looking at each other with wide eyes. Nobody wanted to be the first to say it out loud, but we were all thinking the same thing. What the hell was making those sounds? They seemed to be coming from all around us, getting louder and more frantic. That's when Jim, one of the guys in our group, pointed urgently toward the road we had just come down. "Holy shit, look at that!" he hissed. I'll never forget what I saw when I turned to look. There was this massive, pitch-black figure crossing the road. And when I say massive, I mean massive. It had to have been over 7 feet tall, maybe even 8. But the craziest part was how it moved. This thing crossed the entire width of the road in just 3 huge strides. Its gait was so smooth and graceful, almost like it was gliding. The whole encounter only lasted about 5 seconds, but time seemed to stand still. I remember every detail with crystal clarity. The creature's arms were incredibly long, swinging gently at its sides as it walked. It was covered in dark, shaggy hair from head to toe. But its face, I couldn't make out any features. It was like staring into a black void. The weirdest part was that it didn't even seem to notice us. This thing was so close, maybe 50 yards away at most, but it never turned its head or broke stride. It was like we weren't even there. As quickly as it had appeared, the creature vanished into the thick woods on the other side of the road. We all stood there in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Sarah broke the spell. Did you guys see that too?" she whispered, her voice shaking. We all nodded, too shocked to speak. Suddenly, those weird clicking and screaming noises started up again, louder than ever. That snapped us out of our daze real quick. Without a word, we all turned and ran back toward the ferry dock as fast as our legs could carry us. I've never run so hard in my life. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly, but pure adrenaline and fear kept me going. I kept expecting to feel a clawed hand grab me from behind at any second. When we finally reached the dock, we collapsed in a heap, gasping for air. As we waited for the next ferry, we tried to process what we'd just experienced. None of us could quite believe it, but we had all seen the same thing. There was no denying the reality of what had just happened. The whole way home, we speculated wildly about what the creature could have been. A bear? No, it walked on 2 legs and was way too tall. Bigfoot? Maybe. But what was it doing on a small island off the coast of Massachusetts? Some kind of government experiment gone wrong? The theories got crazier and crazier. In the days and weeks that followed, we tried to find some kind of explanation. We scoured newspapers and libraries for any similar sightings or local legends. We even went to the police, but they just laughed us off as some kids who'd had too much to drink. Eventually, we stopped talking about it, even among ourselves. It was like this unspoken agreement. We knew what we saw, but discussing it only led to more questions we couldn't answer. Life went on, and the memory faded to the back of our minds. But I never forgot. Even now, over 40 years later, I can close my eyes and see that creature as clearly as if it were standing right in front of me. The smooth, purposeful way it moved, the impossible height and bulk of its body, the deep, impenetrable blackness of its form. I've gone back to Plum Island a few times over the years, always half hoping and half dreading that I might see the creature again. But there's been nothing. No weird sounds, no giant footprints, no fleeting glimpses through the trees. It's like it never happened at all. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I remember the looks on my friends' faces that day, the raw fear and disbelief, and I know it was real. I don't know what we saw that day on Plum Island. I don't know if it was some undiscovered species or a ghost or something else entirely, but I do know that it changed me forever. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that exist beyond the edges of what we think we know. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that we stumbled upon something we weren't meant to see, some secret of nature that was never intended for human eyes. And sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet, I find myself straining to hear those eerie clicks and screams echoing through the darkness. I've never told this story publicly before. I guess part of me was afraid of being ridiculed or dismissed as crazy. But I'm getting older now, and I feel like it's important to share what happened. Maybe someone out there has seen something similar. Maybe this will help solve the mystery of what's out there in the woods of Plum Island. All I know is that the image of that creature will stay with me until the day I die. Its effortless stride, its impossible size, the way it seemed to exist in a world apart from our own. Whatever it was real. And it's still out there somewhere, moving silently through the shadows, just beyond the reach of human understanding. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, sometimes I can hardly believe it myself, but I know what I saw that day, and I'll never forget it as long as I live. Story 12. To save money, I used this cheap gas station flashlight to light my way. It barely illuminated a few feet in front of my bike, but it was better than nothing. I'd crank up my headphones and pedal as fast as I could, trying to get home quickly. On this particular night, the air was crisp and the sky was clear. A nearly full moon cast an eerie glow over the landscape. As I rounded a bend in the road near Old Man Johnson's cattle farm, my blood suddenly ran cold. There, in the middle of the road about 50 yards ahead, was a massive, dark figure. At first I thought it was just a shadow, but as I got closer I realized it was moving. This thing was enormous, at least 8 feet tall and proportionally wide. Its body was covered in what looked like dark fur or hair. In the dim moonlight, I couldn't make out any clear features, just this hulking silhouette. I slammed on my brakes, nearly flying over my handlebars. For a split second, we just stared at each other. Then it turned, and with 2 giant strides, disappeared into the forest. The whole encounter lasted maybe 5 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. My mind was reeling, trying to process what I'd just seen. A bear. No way. This thing was walking upright on 2 legs. Some homeless guy in a costume. At 2 a.m. on a deserted road? It didn't make any sense. Panic started to set in, and I realized I was a sitting duck out here in the open. I started pedaling furiously, my legs burning as I pushed myself to go faster than I ever had before. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I kept looking over my shoulder, terrified that whatever it was might be chasing me. The trees seemed to close in around me, branches reaching out like claws in the darkness. I swear I could hear heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush, getting closer and closer. In desperation, I started yelling at the top of my lungs, screaming nonsense, trying to make myself sound big and scary, anything to keep that creature away. My throat quickly went raw, but I kept at it. After what seemed like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes, I finally saw the lights of my neighborhood up ahead. I didn't slow down until I was in my driveway, where I practically fell off my bike and scrambled inside, locking the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night huddled on my couch, jumping at every little sound. Sleep was out of the question. As the sun came up, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was just a bear, and my eyes were playing tricks on me in the dark, or some kid in a Halloween costume pulling a prank. But deep down, I knew those explanations didn't add up. Whatever I saw that night was something else, something that shouldn't exist. I called in sick to work the next day, too shaken up to function. When I finally went back, I immediately put in for a transfer to the day shift. There was no way in hell I was biking down that road at night ever again. It's been over a decade now, and I still get chills thinking about that night. I've never told many people about it. Who would believe me? but I know what I saw. And sometimes late at night, when the wind rustles through the trees outside my window, I swear I can hear those heavy footsteps again. For weeks afterwards, I was constantly on edge. Every shadow made me jump. Every twig snapping in the forest sent my heart racing. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even in broad daylight. I tried to go about my normal routine, but it was impossible. At work, I'd find myself zoning out, replaying that encounter over and over in my mind. My co-workers noticed something was off, but I brushed off their concerns. How could I possibly explain what had happened? One day, I worked up the courage to bike down that road again during daylight hours. I don't know what I was expecting to find. Footprints, maybe. Some sign that what I saw was real and not just a figment of my imagination. As I approached the spot where it happened, my palms started sweating and my chest tightened. But there was nothing there. Just an ordinary stretch of road, peaceful in the afternoon sun. No giant footprints, no broken branches, nothing out of the ordinary at all. I was both relieved and unsettled. Part of me had hoped to find some evidence to validate my experience, but the lack of any physical proof just made me question my sanity even more. On my way back, I passed by Old Man Johnson's farm, and on impulse decided to stop. I'd known him casually for years. He was a gruff but decent guy. As I pulled up, he was out in the yard fixing a tractor. "Afternoon," he grunted, barely looking up from his work. "Hey, Mr. Johnson," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "How's it going?" Everything been normal around here lately?" He gave me an odd look. "Normal as ever. Why'd you ask?" I hesitated, then decided to just go for it. "Well, I was biking home late the other night and I saw something out on the road by your property. It was big, really big, like impossibly tall. I know it sounds crazy, but—" Johnson cut me off with a wave of his hand. "Son, let me stop you right there. I don't know what you think you saw, but my advice is to forget about it. Some things in this world, well, best not to go poking around where you're not wanted. You understand?" His tone was stern, almost threatening. I nodded quickly and mumbled some excuse before pedaling away as fast as I could. As I glanced back, Johnson was still standing there watching me, an unreadable expression on his weathered face. That conversation rattled me even more than the original encounter. It was clear Johnson knew something, but what? And why was he so adamant about keeping it quiet? Over the next few months, I became obsessed with researching similar sightings in the area. I scoured online forums, old newspaper archives, even reached out to a few local paranormal groups. Most of what I found was clearly hoaxes or explainable phenomena. But there were a few accounts that gave me chills, stories eerily similar to my own experience. One in particular stuck with me. In 1973, a group of loggers working in the hills outside of town reported seeing a massive hair-covered creature watching them from the tree line. When they tried to approach it, it let out an ear-splitting howl and vanished into the forest. The men were so shaken they refused to return to work for weeks. It was validating to know I wasn't alone in what I'd seen, but it also terrified me to think that this thing, whatever it was, had been out there for decades, maybe longer. How many other encounters had gone unreported over the years? As time passed, the intensity of my fear gradually faded, but I never forgot what happened that night. I still avoid that stretch of road after dark, and sometimes, when I'm lying in bed unable to sleep, I swear I can hear something moving in the woods behind my house. Something big. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what I encountered that night. Was it some unknown species, a creature from another dimension, or just a product of my overtired mind? I may never know for sure. But one thing I do know, I'll never look at those dark forests the same way again, because now I know what might be lurking in the shadows, watching and waiting. Story 13. It was our second night at the campsite. We'd spent the day fishing and exploring, and I remember feeling so grown up getting to stay up late with the men, listening to their stories around the campfire. The air was crisp, stars twinkling overhead. One of those perfect summer nights, you know. We were all getting ready to turn in when we heard this huge commotion coming from the tree line. At first I thought maybe it was a bear or something, but then we saw them. A whole herd of elk come bursting out of the forest, running like the devil himself was chasing them. And that's when we saw it. I'll never forget that moment as long as I live. This thing came crashing out of the woods after the elk. It was massive, way bigger than any animal I'd ever seen, bigger than my dad even, and he was over 6 feet tall. It was running on 2 legs, but it sure as hell wasn't human. The thing was covered in thick, shaggy black fur from head to toe. I remember my dad grabbing me and pulling me behind him, shielding me. My uncle was shouting something, but I couldn't make out the words over the sound of my own heart pounding in my ears. The creature was barreling through the forest after the elk, knocking down small trees like they were nothing. I'm talking 4, maybe 8-inch thick trunks, just snapping like twigs as this thing plowed through. We all just stood there, frozen, watching as it chased the elk along the edge of the lake and disappeared back into the forest. For a long moment after, the only sound was our ragged breathing and the lap of water against the shore. Then my dad turned to my uncle and said, real quiet like, "What the hell was that, Jim?" My uncle just shook his head, his face pale in the firelight. "I don't know, but we need to get the boys in the tent. Now." They hustled us into the tent, but none of us could sleep. We lay there in the dark, straining our ears for any sound. I remember clutching my sleeping bag, terrified that thing would come back. And come back it did. It must have been past midnight when we heard it, heavy footsteps and the snap of branches. My dad and uncle grabbed their rifles and unzipped the tent, peering out. That's when we heard this sound. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before or since, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through my whole body. My cousin Matt started whimpering, and I wasn't far behind. I wanted to be brave, to be a big boy like my dad always said, but I was scared out of my mind. Through the gap in the tent flap, I could see my dad and uncle, rifles raised, scanning the tree line. And then, there it was. The creature had emerged at the edge of the lake, maybe 50 yards from our campsite. In the moonlight, I could make out its massive silhouette. It was standing upright like a man, but so much bigger. Its arms hung down past its knees, ending in what looked like huge clawed hands. It started making these weird gestures, almost like it was trying to communicate, waving its arms, pounding its chest, all the while making these low, rumbling noises. It was like it was warning us, telling us to get the hell out of its territory. My uncle fired a warning shot into the air, and the thing let out this ear-splitting roar that made my blood run cold. It slammed its fists against its chest and then turned and loped back into the forest, disappearing into the shadows. We spent the rest of the night huddled in that tent, jumping at every little sound. My dad and uncle took turns keeping watch, rifles at the ready. Throughout the night, we could hear it moving around the campsite, grunting and growling. At one point, something heavy struck the side of the tent, and I thought for sure we were done for, but it never actually attacked us. When dawn finally broke, we cautiously emerged from the tent. The campsite was a mess, our supplies scattered everywhere, claw marks on trees, and there, in the soft mud by the lake's edge, were the footprints. They were huge, easily twice the size of my dad's boot. 5 toes, just like a human foot, but massive, and with what looked like claw marks at the tips. My dad and uncle didn't say much as we packed up camp. They kept exchanging these worried glances, like they couldn't believe what had happened, but also couldn't deny it. We hightailed it out of there as fast as we could, and I remember being so relieved when we finally made it back to civilization. For years afterwards, I had nightmares about that night. The sound of trees snapping, that horrible roar, the sight of those massive footprints in the mud. My dad and uncle never really talked about it much. I think they were afraid people would think they were crazy if they told the story. Hell, sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I remember the pure terror I felt that night, and I know it was real. I've done some research over the years, trying to make sense of what we saw. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. I know now that's what we encountered that night. I've read other people's accounts, seen grainy videos and blurry photos, but nothing quite captures the sheer terror of coming face to face with something like that in the wilderness. I'm an old man now, and I've never been back to Riding Mountain National Park. I still love the outdoors, still go fishing when I can, but I always make sure to camp in well-populated areas these days. And whenever I'm in the woods and hear an unexplained noise, a chill runs down my spine as I remember that night back in '67 when my family and I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist. I don't know if that creature is still out there, roaming the forests of Manitoba. Part of me hopes it is. There's something awe-inspiring about the idea that there are still mysteries in this world, things we can't explain. But mostly, I hope no one else ever has to experience the terror we felt that night. Some things are better left in the shadows. Story 14. I've never been much of a hunter, but I've always enjoyed spending time in nature. That's why I decided to go on a solo hunting trip during the black powder season in Harland County, Kentucky. I'd heard it was beautiful country, with lots of dense forest and rugged terrain, perfect for getting away from it all, and maybe bagging a deer if I got lucky. I set up camp in a remote area near some old mining sites, figuring the deer might use those clearings to graze. The first couple days were uneventful, just me, the woods, and the occasional squirrel or bird. But on the third morning, everything changed. I woke up before dawn, like usual, and hiked out to a promising spot I'd scouted. As the sky started to lighten, I settled in at the base of a large oak tree, my old muzzle loader across my lap. The woods were quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves or bird call. That's when I saw them. At first I thought it was just a bear and her cub emerging from the tree line about 100 yards away. But as I watched, I realized these were no bears. They walked upright, on two legs, with a smooth gait that was unsettlingly human-like. The larger one had to be at least 7 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. The smaller one came up to about its waist. I froze, hardly daring to breathe. What the hell was I looking at? My mind raced through possibilities: bears, escaped gorillas, guys in costumes. But deep down, I knew this was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist. For several long moments, we just stared at each other across the clearing. Their eyes glowed a dull orange in the dim light. I had the eerie sense they were studying me just as intently as I was studying them. The larger one cocked its head, almost bird-like, as if trying to figure me out. Suddenly, the smaller one darted forward a few steps and hurled something in my direction. I flinched as a branch clattered against the tree trunk next to me. The creature bounced excitedly and made a series of high-pitched whooping sounds. Was it playing? The larger one lumbered forward then, swinging its massive arms. My heart started racing. It was easily twice my size, with hands as big as dinner plates. Without thinking, I raised my rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The blast echoed through the trees. Birds scattered in alarm. The creatures froze for a split second. Then the big one let out a guttural roar that made my hair stand on end. It was like nothing I've ever heard, part bear, part lion, but with an almost human quality that chilled me to the bone. The smaller one immediately turned and bolted for the tree line, crying out in what sounded like fear or distress. The larger one hesitated, looking from me to the fleeing young one. It let out another roar, then turned and loped after its offspring with surprising speed for something so large. I sat there shaking for what felt like hours, rifle clutched to my chest. Had that really just happened? Part of me wanted to pack up and get the hell out of there, but I knew no one would believe me without proof. I needed to go back and look for tracks, hair samples, anything. As the day wore on and nothing else strange happened, I started to calm down a bit. Maybe I'd just spooked a mama bear and her cub. Maybe the weird upright gait and glowing eyes were tricks of the early morning light. I decided to stay one more night and investigate in the morning when I had better light. That was a mistake. I barely slept that night, jumping at every little sound. As soon as it was light enough to see, I grabbed my gear and headed back to the clearing. What I found made my blood run cold. My carefully arranged campsite was completely destroyed. The tent was shredded, sleeping bag torn to pieces, but it wasn't random animal destruction. Things had clearly been sorted through methodically. All my food was gone, wrappers discarded in a pile. Tools and gear were scattered about, some broken as if tested for usefulness. What really got me were the footprints. Huge, human-like prints pressed deep into the soft earth, and right next to them, a set of smaller prints, like a child's. They were all over the campsite, showing how the creatures had systematically gone through my things. I stood there trembling, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. This was intentional, intelligent behavior. No animal does this. Whatever I'd encountered yesterday, it wasn't some undiscovered species of ape. It was something much stranger and potentially much more dangerous. I grabbed what supplies I could salvage and got out of there as fast as my legs would carry me. I've been an avid outdoorsman my whole life, but I've never felt so small and vulnerable as I did fleeing through those woods. Every shadow seemed to hold lurking danger. Every snapping twig sent jolts of adrenaline through me. I made it back to my truck and tore out of there, not stopping until I was safely back in town. I considered reporting what happened to the authorities, but what would I even say? I had no real proof, just a wild story that would probably get me laughed out of the station or sent for a psych eval. So I've kept it to myself until now. But I can't stop thinking about what I saw out there. Those creatures were real. They were intelligent. And they're still out there in those Kentucky woods, watching and waiting. I don't know if they're some kind of missing link or something else entirely. But I do know one thing. I'm never going back to those woods again. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Story 15. I was out hunting in the Siskiyou Mountains with my buddy Bill Cole back in '44. The war was still raging overseas, but out here in the California wilderness, it felt a world away. We'd been trekking through the dense forest for hours, hoping to bag a deer or two. The air was crisp and the leaves crunched under our boots as we made our way up the mountainside. As the day wore on, we decided to split up to cover more ground. I headed west while Bill went east, agreeing to meet back at our campsite before sundown. The forest grew quieter and darker as I ventured deeper into unfamiliar territory. An uneasy feeling started to creep over me, like I was being watched. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just nerves from being alone in the wild. That's when I heard it, a strange guttural sound, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was deep and resonant, almost like a moan, but not quite human. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I froze in place, straining my ears and scanning the trees around me. For a few moments there was only silence. Then I heard heavy footsteps, branches snapping under massive weight. My heart was pounding as I slowly turned towards the sound. Through the trees about 50 yards away, I saw movement. At first I thought it might be a bear, but as it came into view I realized this was something else entirely. The creature was enormous, at least 7 feet tall and covered in dark, matted fur. It walked on 2 legs with a lumbering gait, swinging its long arms. I couldn't believe my eyes. This thing looked like no animal I'd ever seen or heard of. It was built like a man, but far larger and more primitive. As I watched in stunned silence, I realized it was carrying something. To my horror, I saw what looked like a limp human body slung over its shoulder. Every instinct told me to run, but I was paralyzed with fear and disbelief. The creature hadn't seemed to notice me yet. It was moving quickly despite its bulk, heading up the slope away from me. In a matter of seconds, it disappeared into the thick undergrowth. I stood there shaking for what felt like hours, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. Had I really seen that, or was my mind playing tricks on me? Eventually I snapped out of it and hurried back towards our campsite, constantly looking over my shoulder. When I got there, Bill wasn't back yet. I paced anxiously, chain-smoking cigarettes as I waited. The sun was starting to set when he finally stumbled into camp, looking pale and shaken. Before I could say anything, he blurted out, "Did you see it too?" We compared notes in hushed, nervous tones. Bill had encountered the creature as well, though from a greater distance. He described the same massive, hair-covered beast I'd seen, but he insisted he'd been awake and alert the whole time, not unconscious as I'd feared when I saw the creature carrying what I thought was a body. We debated what to do. Should we report it to the authorities? Would anyone even believe us? In the end, we decided to pack up camp immediately and get the hell out of there. The whole way home, we kept glancing into the darkness beyond the road, half expecting to see glowing eyes or a hulking shape emerge from the trees. Back in Fresno, we tried to go about our normal lives, but the memory of what we'd seen haunted us. I had trouble sleeping, plagued by nightmares of being chased through dark forests by giant, inhuman creatures. During the day, I'd find myself zoning out at work, reliving those terrifying moments over and over. I wrote to Bill a few weeks later, needing to talk about it again. Part of me still couldn't believe it had really happened, but Bill's response confirmed it wasn't just some shared delusion. He'd seen it too, and was struggling just as much as I was to make sense of the experience. For years afterwards, we avoided discussing that hunting trip. It was too disturbing, too inexplicable. I threw myself into my work at the safe company, trying to focus on the solid, comprehensible world of locks and metal. But I never went hunting in those mountains again. The memory of that creature was seared into my mind, a glimpse of something that defied explanation and shattered my understanding of the natural world. Even now, decades later, I sometimes wake up in a cold sweat, the vivid image of that hairy, primitive giant fresh in my mind. I've read accounts over the years of similar sightings in the Pacific Northwest. Some call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I don't know what to believe anymore. All I know is what I saw that day was real, and it changed me forever. I've never spoken publicly about this before. Who would believe such an outlandish tale? But as I've gotten older, I've felt a growing need to share my story. Maybe someone out there has had a similar experience. Maybe it will help shed light on whatever is out there in the wilderness. All I can say is there are things in this world beyond our understanding. I saw one with my own eyes, and the memory of it will haunt me to my grave. The strangest part is how abruptly it all happened and ended. One moment I was having a normal day hunting, the next I was face to face with something impossible, and then it was gone, leaving me to question my own sanity. Did it really happen? Where did the creature come from, and where did it go? Why haven't there been more sightings in that area? I've spent countless hours poring over maps of the Siskiyou Mountains, trying to pinpoint the exact location where we had our encounter. But the forest all looks the same, and my memory of that day is hazy with fear and disbelief. Part of me wants to go back, to try to find some tangible evidence, but a bigger part is terrified of what I might find, or what might find me. Sometimes I wonder if Bill and I stumbled upon some kind of secret. Maybe there's a reason these creatures have managed to stay hidden for so long. Are there people out there who know the truth and are keeping it under wraps? The thought sends chills down my spine. I'm an old man now, and I know my time is limited, but I can't go to my grave without sharing this story. It may sound crazy, but I swear on everything I hold dear that it's the truth. That day in the Siskiyou Mountains, I saw something that shouldn't exist, and it's been the defining moment of my life ever since. To anyone reading this who might have had a similar experience, you're not alone. And to those who doubt, all I can say is, I hope you never have to see what I saw. Some things are better left in the realm of legend and campfire stories, but sometimes the legends turn out to be all too real. Story 16. I was just a high school kid back in '67, living in Elfers, Florida. It was a small town where not much ever happened, you know. January rolled around, and there was this big dance everyone was excited about. Me and my girlfriend Lisa decided to go with our friends Jack and Cindy. The night started off normal enough. We all got dressed up, met at Jack's place, and headed to the school gym. The dance itself was pretty typical. Cheesy decorations, punch that tasted like sugar water, and the same songs they always played. Around 10 p.m., we were getting kinda bored and restless. Jack suggested we head out to Lover's Lane for some privacy. It was this secluded spot just outside town where couples would park to make out. We were all for it, so we piled into Jack's Chevy and drove out there. It was a clear night, but super dark once we got away from the town lights. Jack found a good spot to park, hidden by some trees. We killed the engine and just sat there for a bit, talking and joking around. The radio was playing softly. Everything seemed perfectly normal at first. After a few minutes, Lisa wrinkled her nose and asked, "Do you guys smell that?" I didn't notice anything at first, but then this nasty odor hit me. It was like rotten eggs mixed with garbage or something. Cindy rolled down her window, thinking maybe it was coming from inside the car, but that just made it worse. "What the hell is that?" Jack muttered, looking around outside. We all started peering out the windows, wondering if maybe an animal had died nearby or something, but we couldn't see much of anything in the darkness. The smell kept getting stronger, and I was starting to feel kinda nauseous. Lisa suggested we leave, but Jack was determined to figure out where it was coming from. He flipped on the headlights to get a better look. That's when things got really weird. Out of nowhere, this thing leaped onto the hood of the car. I swear to God, I've never seen anything like it before or since. It was about the size of a chimpanzee, but its skin was this sickly greenish color, and its eyes, man, those eyes. They were glowing bright green, reflecting the headlights. We all started screaming. Lisa was clutching my arm so tight it hurt. Jack was yelling and fumbling with the keys, trying to start the car. Cindy just froze, staring at the creature with her mouth hanging open. It crouched there on the hood for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. Those glowing eyes swept over all of us, like it was studying us. I remember thinking how unnaturally still it was, barely even blinking. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it leaped off the car and vanished into the woods. We sat there in stunned silence for a moment, trying to process what we'd just seen. Jack finally got the car started and peeled out of there so fast he left tire marks. We were all in a panic, talking over each other and trying to make sense of it. Jack kept saying it had to be someone in a costume playing a prank, but I knew that wasn't right. The way it moved, those eyes, it was too real. We debated what to do as Jack sped back towards town. None of us wanted to go home yet. We were too freaked out to be alone, so we decided to go to the police station and report what happened. The cop on duty clearly thought we were making it up at first. He kept asking if we'd been drinking or smoking anything, but we insisted it was real and begged him to go check it out. I think he saw how genuinely scared we all were and realized this wasn't just some dumb kid's prank. He radioed another officer to meet him out there, then told us to wait at the station. We sat there for over an hour, jumping at every little noise. When the cops finally came back, they looked pretty shaken up themselves. They hadn't seen the creature, but they found this weird, sticky green substance on the hood of Jack's car where it had been crouching. They took samples of it and told us they'd send it to a lab for analysis. We gave our official statements, describing every detail we could remember. The police told us to go straight home and not talk to anyone else about what happened. They said they'd be in touch once they knew more. That was almost 60 years ago now, and I still think about that night all the time. We never did hear back from the police about those samples. Whenever I tried to follow up over the years, I just got stonewalled. The four of us stayed close for a while after that, bonded by our shared experience. But eventually we drifted apart as life took us in different directions. Last I heard, Jack had moved out west somewhere. I lost touch with Cindy years ago. Lisa and I dated through the rest of high school, but broke up when we went to different colleges. I've told this story to a few people over the years, but most just think I'm crazy or making it up. I get it. I probably wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't lived through it. But I know what I saw that night. That creature was real, and there's no explaining it away. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there somewhere, hiding in the woods. Other times I think maybe it was some kind of government experiment that got loose, or hell, maybe it really was an alien. I don't know. All I know is that night changed me. I've never felt truly safe in the dark since then. Every time I'm out in nature, there's a part of me that's on high alert, watching for those glowing green eyes. I'm an old man now, and I know my time is probably limited. That's why I'm finally sharing this story publicly. I need people to know what happened that night in Elfers. I need someone to believe me before I'm gone. If you're reading this and you've seen something similar, please reach out, or if you have any information about what that creature might have been, I'm begging you to share it. I've spent my whole life wondering, and I'd give anything for some answers before I die. To this day, I can still smell that awful stench when I think about it. I can still see those piercing green eyes staring into my soul. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't of this world, and the thought that it might still be out there somewhere keeps me up at night. I don't expect anyone to believe me, but I swear on everything I hold dear, every word of this is true. That night in Lover's Lane, we came face to face with something beyond explanation, and nothing in my life has ever been the same since. Story 17. I was shaking as I typed this, reliving that terrifying day on Mount Ashland back in '68. Even now, decades later, I can still feel the chill that ran down my spine when I first laid eyes on that thing. It was supposed to be a fun camping trip with my buddy Dawn. We'd driven up from San Francisco to escape the city for a while, enjoy some fresh air in the Siskiyou Mountains. The weather was perfect that May. Warm sunshine, clear blue skies. We'd set up our little campsite near a scenic overlook, with breathtaking views of the forested slopes. That morning started off normal enough. We'd just finished breakfast and were sitting around sipping coffee and planning our hike for the day. I remember the birdsong, the gentle rustle of wind through the pines. It was so peaceful. Then we heard it, a loud cracking sound followed by a rumble. At first I thought it might be thunder, but the sky was cloudless. Dawn jumped up, pointing towards a nearby cliff face. "Look!" he shouted. "Rock slide!" Sure enough, I could see small boulders and debris tumbling down the steep incline, but as I squinted up at the cliff, trying to see what had caused it, my blood ran cold. There, silhouetted against the morning sky, was a massive dark shape. "What the hell is that?" I whispered. Dawn was already reaching for his hunting rifle. As the dust settled, I got my first clear look at the creature. It was enormous, easily 8 feet tall, maybe more, covered in thick, shaggy fur that looked almost blue-black in the sunlight. But what struck me most was how human-like it seemed. It stood upright, balanced on two legs. The proportions were all wrong, though. Arms too long, shoulders impossibly broad. Dawn had his rifle up, peering through the scope. His face had gone pale. "Eric," he said, voice shaking, "you're not going to believe this. It has a face, like a person's face, but not. The eyes, man. The eyes look so human." I fumbled for my camera, determined to get proof of what we were seeing. But my hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold it steady. I snapped off a few shots, praying they'd come out clear. The creature hadn't moved, just stood there on the cliff edge, staring down at us. Then it opened its mouth and let out a sound I'll never forget as long as I live. It wasn't quite a roar, wasn't quite speech. More like a call, as if it was trying to communicate. The sound echoed off the mountain slopes, making the hair on my arms stand up. "We need to get out of here," Dawn hissed, lowering his rifle. But before we could move, the thing turned and loped off into the forest, vanishing among the trees with surprising speed for its size. We stood there in shocked silence for a long moment. Then Dawn grabbed my arm. "Come on," he said. "We have to see if it left any traces." Part of me wanted to just pack up and get the hell out of there. But curiosity won out. We cautiously made our way up towards where we'd seen the creature. As we got closer, the stench hit us, a powerful, musky odor that made my eyes water. "Oh, God," Dawn gagged. "You smell that?" I nodded, pulling my shirt up over my nose. That's when I saw them, the footprints. Massive impressions in the soft forest loam, easily twice the size of my own foot. They led off into the underbrush, in the direction the creature had fled. "Look at this," Dawn called. He was crouched near a small clearing, examining something on the ground. As I approached, I realized what it was. A pile of droppings. But these were huge, nothing like any animal scat I'd ever seen. "We need to document this," I said, pulling out my camera again. This time my hands were steadier as I snapped photos of the prints and other evidence. We spent the next hour scouring the area, looking for any other signs. But aside from a few broken branches high up in the trees, there was nothing. It was as if the creature had simply vanished. Back at our campsite, we debated what to do. Part of me wanted to hike out immediately and report what we'd seen to the rangers or police. But Dawn argued against it. "They'll think we're crazy," he said. "Or worse, they'll think we're making it up for attention. We need more proof." So we stayed. For 3 more days, we combed those woods, hoping for another glimpse of the creature. But there was nothing. No sounds, no sightings, not even any fresh tracks. It was maddening. On our last night there, as we sat around the campfire, we heard it again, that strange, haunting call echoing from deep in the forest. We both froze, straining to pinpoint the direction, but it only sounded once, then faded away into the night. When we got back to San Francisco, I immediately got my film developed, but my heart sank as I flipped through the photos. The ones of the footprints and droppings came out clear enough, but the shots of the creature itself, all blurry, indistinct. You could make out a vague, dark shape, but nothing that would convince a skeptic. We told a few close friends about what happened, but most just laughed it off or assumed we were exaggerating. Eventually, we stopped talking about it altogether, but I've never forgotten. I've been back to Mount Ashland a few times over the years, always hoping to see it again, to prove to myself I didn't imagine it all. But there's been nothing, just the wind in the pines and the endless green of the forest. Sometimes late at night I still hear that call in my dreams, and I wonder, is it still out there, somewhere in those mountains, watching, waiting, and will anyone ever believe me if I tell them what I saw that day? I don't know if I'll ever have answers, but I know what I saw, and I know that somewhere out there in the wild places of the world, there are things beyond our understanding, things that defy explanation. And sometimes, if we're lucky or unlucky, we catch a glimpse of them. Story 18. It was a dark, moonless night in Walawala. I had stayed late at my buddy's place watching the game and lost track of time. By the time I left, it was well past midnight. The roads were completely deserted as I cruised along on my Harley, the rumble of the engine the only sound breaking the eerie silence. As I approached the area near Camp Kiwanis, I started to get an uneasy feeling. The trees seemed to loom over the road, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. I shook it off, telling myself I was just tired and letting my imagination run wild. But then I saw it. At first, it was just a massive shadow at the edge of my headlight beam. I blinked hard, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. But as I got closer, the shadow took form, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Standing there, right at the edge of the road, was the biggest creature I've ever seen in my life. It had to be at least 10 feet tall, maybe even 12. The sheer size of it was mind-boggling. My headlight illuminated its lower half, but its head and shoulders were lost in the darkness above. I slowed down instinctively, too shocked to do anything else. That's when it moved. The creature turned towards me and let out the most blood-curdling sound I've ever heard. It was like a scream, but not human, more like a high-pitched roar that sent shivers down my spine. Its arms shot out towards me, impossibly long and thick. I couldn't make out any details in the darkness, but the silhouette alone was terrifying enough. In that moment, I was absolutely certain that if those arms reached me, I was done for. Pure adrenaline and terror kicked in. I twisted the throttle as hard as I could, the bike's engine roaring to life. I shot past the creature, so close I could feel the rush of air as its arms swung towards me. I didn't look back. I didn't slow down. I rode that bike faster than I ever have in my life, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The whole way home, I kept expecting to see that massive shadow in my mirrors, to hear that horrifying scream again. When I finally made it home, I was shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the door. I stumbled inside and collapsed on the couch, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. As the adrenaline wore off, I started to question myself. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Could it have been a bear standing on its hind legs? But no bear I've ever seen or heard of comes close to that size. And that scream, that was no sound any normal animal makes. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that massive silhouette, those long arms reaching for me. I kept hearing that scream echoing in my head. The next day, I was a wreck. I called in sick to work, unable to face people or try to explain what had happened. I spent the day going over and over it in my mind, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Part of me wanted to go back, to see if there was any evidence, tracks, broken branches, anything. But the thought of encountering that thing again in broad daylight was even more terrifying. What if it was still out there, waiting? I've always been a skeptic when it comes to stories about Bigfoot or other cryptids. I never put much stock in grainy photos or second-hand accounts. But after what I saw that night, I don't know what to believe anymore. The thing that haunts me most is the uncertainty. I can't say for sure if it was covered in hair or not. The darkness and the shock of the moment left so many details blurry. But I know with absolute certainty that what I saw wasn't any normal animal. It wasn't a person in a costume. It was something else. In the days and weeks that followed, I scoured local news and online forums, looking for any similar sightings or reports. But there was nothing. No missing person reports, no stories of giant creatures roaming the woods. It's like it never happened, except I know it did. I've thought about reporting it to the authorities, but what would I say? That I saw a 12-foot tall monster on Mill Creek Road? They'd think I was crazy or on drugs. And honestly, sometimes I wonder if I am crazy. If maybe the stress and fatigue of that late-night ride somehow made me hallucinate the whole thing. But then I remember the visceral terror I felt in that moment, the way my entire body reacted to the presence of that creature. That's not something you can imagine or hallucinate. It was real as anything I've ever experienced. I still ride my motorcycle, but I never take Mill Creek Road at night anymore. I've changed my whole routine to avoid being in that area after dark. Some of my friends have noticed and asked about it, but I just make excuses. How could I possibly explain? The experience has changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I find myself looking over my shoulder more, especially when I'm out in nature. Every unusual sound in the woods makes me jump. I've become hyper-aware of my surroundings, always on edge, always watching for that massive shadow. I've tried to find logical explanations. Maybe it was some kind of experimental military robot or drone. Maybe it was an escaped zoo animal, though I can't imagine what kind. I've even considered the possibility that it was some kind of shared hallucination, triggered by some unknown environmental factor. But none of these explanations truly fit what I experienced. The worst part is the not knowing what it was, why it was there, or if I'll ever see it again, not knowing if I'm the only one who's encountered this thing, or if there are others out there too afraid or too disbelieved to come forward. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I find myself wondering about that creature. Is it still out there in the woods around Walawala? Is it alone, or are there more of them? And what would have happened if I hadn't been able to speed away on my bike? I've thought about reaching out to cryptozoologists or paranormal investigators, but I'm afraid of the attention it might bring. What if people start combing the woods, looking for this thing? What if they find it? Or worse, what if it finds them? So I've kept this to myself, carrying the weight of this secret, this inexplicable encounter. Until now, sharing it here, hoping that maybe someone out there has seen something similar, that maybe I'm not alone in this. I know how it sounds. I know that if someone had told me this story before that night, I would have dismissed it as a tall tale or a vivid nightmare. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know that out there, in the dark woods around Walawala, there's something that defies explanation. Something that, for one terrifying moment, reached out for me. I don't know if I'll ever have answers. I don't know if I'll ever fully come to terms with what happened that night. But I do know one thing. I'll never forget that massive silhouette, those reaching arms, and that bone-chilling scream. And I'll never ride down Mill Creek Road at night again. Story 19. We'd been pedaling for about an hour, enjoying the crisp fall air and beautiful autumn colors. The trail was pretty secluded, winding through dense forest. We were chatting and laughing, not really paying attention to our surroundings. Suddenly, I heard a weird rustling sound coming from the bushes off to our right. I slowed down a bit, thinking it was probably just a deer or something. But then I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, and my heart nearly stopped. There, emerging from the underbrush about 50 feet ahead of us, was the most horrifying creature I've ever seen. At first glance, it looked like some kind of massive dog, maybe a German shepherd on steroids. But as it fully came into view, I realized this was no normal animal. It was enormous, at least 7 feet tall, standing upright on 2 legs. The body was muscular and covered in thick black fur with grayish stripes. But the face, oh God, the face! It had a long snout like a dog, but the eyes were eerily intelligent and almost human-like. The ears were large and pointed straight up. Stuart and I screeched to a halt, frozen in shock and terror. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 20-30 seconds, we just stared at each other, Us, gaping in disbelief, the creature studying us intently with those unnerving eyes. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was this some kind of escaped science experiment? A demon? The stuff of campfire legends come to life? It didn't seem possible, and yet there it was, plain as day. The creature tilted its head, almost quizzically, still watching us. I noticed its hands, if you could call them that. They were more like paws, but elongated with what looked like opposable thumbs. A chill ran down my spine as I realized this thing could probably use tools if it wanted to. I was vaguely aware of Stuart trembling beside me, his breathing quick and panicked. I wanted to run, to pedal away as fast as I could, but I was paralyzed with fear. Some primal instinct told me that any sudden movement would trigger the creature to attack. After what seemed like an eternity, the beast slowly turned and loped back into the forest on its hind legs. The way it moved was so unnatural, a bizarre mix of canine and human gait that made my skin crawl. As soon as it disappeared from view, Stuart and I looked at each other wild-eyed, both of us gasping for breath. Without a word, we turned our bikes around and pedaled faster than I thought possible, desperate to get as far away from that place as we could. We didn't stop or slow down until we reached Stuart's truck about 5 miles back. We threw our bikes in the bed and peeled out of there, tires kicking up gravel. For a long time, we drove in stunned silence, both trying to process what we'd just experienced. Finally, Stuart spoke up in a shaky voice. What the hell was that thing?" I shook my head, still in disbelief. "I have no idea, man. I've never seen anything like it." We debated whether to report it to the police or park rangers, but who would believe us? We'd sound like we were crazy or on drugs. So we made a pact to keep it to ourselves, at least for the time being. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature's face, that impossible mix of canine and human features. I kept imagining it lurking outside my window, waiting to pounce. Over the next few days, I obsessively researched similar sightings online. To my shock, I found quite a few accounts of something called a dogman in Michigan and surrounding states. The descriptions were eerily similar to what we saw, a large bipedal canine creature, often with dark fur and stripes. I also dug into the history of the area where we had our encounter. Turns out there are some old Native American legends about shape-shifting wolf creatures in those woods. And more recently, there had been a string of unexplained livestock mutilations in nearby farms. The more I read, the more convinced I became that what we saw was real. But that realization brought little comfort. If this thing was out there, what else might be lurking in the shadows that we don't know about? I haven't been back to those woods since that day, and I don't think I ever will. The memory of that creature is seared into my brain. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, imagining those intelligent predatory eyes watching me from the darkness. Stuart and I don't talk about it much anymore. It's like this unspoken thing between us. We both know what we saw, but discussing it makes it too real somehow. Plus, I think we're both a little afraid that if we acknowledge it too much, it might somehow draw the creature's attention to us again. I've thought about reporting it to researchers or cryptozoologists, but I'm worried about being labeled a kook or attracting unwanted attention. So for now, I'm just trying to move on with my life and pretend it never happened. But late at night, when the house is quiet and dark, I can't help but wonder, is it still out there? Are there more of them? And what would happen if one day it decided to venture out of the woods and into our world? I know this all sounds completely insane. If someone had told me this story a few months ago, I would have thought they were making it up or hallucinating. But I know what I saw. It was real. It was terrifying, and it fundamentally changed how I view the world. I guess I'm sharing this now as a way to process it, and maybe as a warning to others. If you're ever out in those woods near Clam Lake, keep your eyes open and your wits about you. There are things in this world beyond our understanding, and some of them have teeth and claws. I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully explain or understand what Stuart and I encountered that day. Was it some kind of undiscovered species? A government experiment gone wrong? Something supernatural? I honestly don't know, and part of me doesn't want to know. All I know is that the world suddenly seems a lot bigger, stranger, and more dangerous than I ever realized. And I'll never look at the woods the same way again. Sometimes I catch myself scanning the tree line when I'm driving down a country road, half expecting to see that creature emerge from the shadows. I've become hyper-aware of strange noises at night, always wondering if it could be out there. I've also developed a weird fascination with dogs since the encounter. I find myself studying their faces, trying to imagine what they'd look like if they suddenly stood up and grew to human size. It's a disturbing thought that I can't seem to shake. Stuart and I still hang out, but things are different now. There's this unspoken tension between us, like we're both afraid to bring up what happened. We don't go biking anymore. Too many bad memories. Instead, we stick to indoor activities or well-populated areas. I've thought about moving away from Michigan entirely, just to put some distance between myself and that place. But then I think, what if these things exist in other places too? What if nowhere is truly safe? It's been months now, and I still haven't found a way to fully come to terms with what happened. I've considered therapy, but how do you explain something like this to a mental health professional without sounding completely unhinged? So I keep it bottled up, trying to go about my daily life as if everything is normal. But it's always there in the back of my mind, the memory of that creature, the feeling of being watched, the knowledge that the world is far stranger and more dangerous than most people realize. I guess I'm sharing this now in the hopes that maybe someone out there has had a similar experience. Maybe I'm not alone in this. Or maybe I just need to get it off my chest to have some record of what happened in case something happens to me. Because deep down, I can't shake the feeling that this isn't over. That somehow, someday, I'll come face to face with that creature again. And next time, I might not be lucky enough to just walk away. So if you're ever in the woods of northern Michigan, or really any secluded forest area, stay alert. Watch the shadows. Listen for unusual sounds. And if you see something that doesn't look quite right, something that seems to exist in that uncanny valley between animal and human, don't stick around to investigate. Just run. Run as fast and as far as you can. Because there are things out there in the dark, things that shouldn't exist but do, things with sharp teeth, intelligent eyes, and an interest in us that I don't think we want to understand. Be safe out there, and always keep one eye on the woods. Story 20. I still remember that day like it was yesterday, even though it's been over 20 years now. It was the summer of 2001, and I had just graduated college with my computer science degree. I was 22 years old, living in San Francisco, and working my first job as a junior programmer at a tech startup. I was your typical nerdy, introverted coder, spending most of my time in front of screens and not getting out much. But that summer, I decided I needed an adventure. I had always been fascinated by the great outdoors, even if I didn't have much experience with it. So I got it in my head that I was going to hike a section of the Pacific Crest Trail in Northern California. Looking back, I was woefully unprepared. I had barely ever been camping before, let alone on a solo backpacking trip. But I was young and naive and thought, how hard could it be? I did some basic research online, bought some gear from REI, and headed out to Lassen Volcanic National Park, where I planned to hike a 50-mile section over 5 days. The first couple days were tough but exhilarating. I was sore and exhausted, but loving the solitude and natural beauty. By the third day, though, I was really struggling. My feet were covered in blisters. I was running low on food, and I was starting to regret my decision to do this alone. That fateful evening, I made camp near a small river, grateful for the chance to soak my aching feet in the cool water. As the sun started to set, casting an orange glow through the trees, I sat by the shore eating a sad dinner of trail mix and beef jerky. I was lost in thought, questioning my life choices, when movement across the river caught my eye. At first I thought it was a bear, but as I focused on the shape emerging from the tree line, I realized it was walking on two legs. For a split second, my brain tried to make sense of what I was seeing. A person, way out here. But then it stepped fully into view, and I felt my blood run cold. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall and covered in thick, dark fur. It moved with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large. As it approached the river's edge, I could make out powerful, muscular limbs and huge hands. This was no person in a costume. This was something else entirely. I was frozen in place, afraid to move a muscle. The creature, and I knew with absolute certainty that this was Bigfoot, knelt down at the water's edge about 30 yards away from me. It cupped its massive hands and began to drink, seemingly unaware of my presence. But then it paused and slowly raised its head. Our eyes met, and I felt a jolt of terror course through me. Its eyes were a deep, dark red, almost black, but with a definite reddish tint that seemed to glow in the fading light. They were undeniably intelligent eyes, filled with a wisdom and awareness that shook me to my core. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 20-30 seconds, we stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was certain I was about to die, but the creature made no aggressive moves. It simply observed me with what I can only describe as curiosity. Then, with deliberate slowness, it rose to its full height. God, it was enormous. It towered over me, radiating strength and power. But it made no move to approach. Instead, it gave me one last long look, then turned and melted back into the forest with shocking speed and silence for something so large. I sat there for I don't know how long, shaking uncontrollably. Part of me wondered if I had hallucinated the whole thing, but I knew deep in my bones that what I had seen was real. When I finally gathered the courage to move, I frantically packed up my campsite in the growing darkness and hiked through the night, too terrified to sleep. I made it back to civilization the next day and immediately went home, cutting my trip short. For weeks afterwards I was jumpy and on edge. I couldn't sleep without nightmares. I told a few friends what had happened, but they all assumed I was exaggerating or had seen a bear. I quickly learned to keep it to myself. But I've never forgotten that encounter. Those eyes haunt me to this day. I've spent countless hours researching Bigfoot sightings and theories since then. I'm convinced now that it chose not to harm me. Maybe it sensed I wasn't a threat. Maybe it was just as curious about me as I was about it. I've never gone back to that section of the PCT. Part of me wants to prove to myself that it really happened. But a bigger part of me is still terrified at the thought. I don't know if I believe all the Bigfoot stories out there, but I know what I saw, and I know that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that most people will never see or understand. That day changed me profoundly. I still work in tech, but I've become much more of an outdoorsman over the years. I go hiking and camping often, always with a group now. And every time I'm in the wilderness, I find myself scanning the tree line, wondering if I'll ever have another encounter. Part of me hopes I do. Part of me prays I never will. I don't expect anyone to believe my story. Hell, most days I have a hard time believing it myself, but I know what I saw, and I'll never forget those eyes, that deep, primal intelligence that seemed to look right through me. Whatever that creature was, it was no mere animal, and its existence challenges everything we think we know about the world around us. I've never shared this story publicly before, but I felt compelled to write it down, to get it out of my head where it's lived for all these years. Maybe someone out there has had a similar experience. Maybe I'm not alone in carrying this secret. All I know is that my encounter with Bigfoot that day shattered my understanding of reality, and I've never seen the world the same way since. Story 21. I grew up on a farm that's been in my family for generations. It's a beautiful place, with vast prairies stretching as far as the eye can see and dense forests bordering our land. But there's something about this place that most people wouldn't believe if I told them. We're not alone out here. There are creatures that live in the wilderness around our property. We call them the Prairie people. I've known about the Prairie people for as long as I can remember. My parents and grandparents before them always spoke of them in hushed tones, as if saying their name too loudly might summon them. As a kid, I thought they were just trying to scare us to keep us from wandering too far from the house. But I know better now. I've seen them with my own eyes. The first time I saw one of the Prairie people, I was about 8 years old. I was out in the fields with my dad, helping him check the fences. It was a hot summer day, the kind where the air shimmers with heat rising off the tall grass. I remember feeling tired and thirsty, wishing we could go back to the house. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, or maybe a coyote in the distance. But as I squinted against the sun, I realized it was something else entirely. It was tall, much taller than any animal I'd ever seen out here, and it was standing on 2 legs. I tugged on my dad's sleeve, pointing frantically. "Dad, look! What is that?" He turned slowly, his face going pale as he saw what I was pointing at. Without a word, he grabbed my arm and started walking briskly back towards the truck. I kept looking over my shoulder, fascinated and terrified by the figure in the distance. It didn't move, just stood there watching us. As we got in the truck and drove away, I saw it melt back into the grass like it had never been there at all. That night, my parents sat us down. Me, my older brother, and my little sister, who was only 4 at the time, and explained about the Prairie people. They told us not to be afraid, that they'd been here long before us and would be here long after. They said we had to respect them and their territory, and in turn, they would respect ours. But what are they? I remember asking, my young mind struggling to comprehend. My mom just smiled sadly and said, "They're a part of this land, just like we are. We don't always understand them, but we have to learn to live alongside them." Over the years, I had more encounters with the Prairie people. Sometimes it was just glimpses, a shadow moving unnaturally fast at the edge of the woods, or eyes glowing in the darkness beyond the reach of our porch light. Other times, it was more substantial. There was the time I found strange footprints in the mud near our creek. They were huge, easily twice the size of my dad's boots, and shaped all wrong. The toes were too long, splayed out like fingers. I showed my brother, and he just shook his head and told me not to think about it too much. Then there was the night I woke up to the sound of something scratching at my bedroom window. I was too terrified to look, just lay there with my eyes squeezed shut until morning. When I finally worked up the courage to check, there were deep gouges in the wooden frame that hadn't been there before. But the worst incident, the one that still haunts me to this day, happened when I was 12. It was early spring, and my little sister and I were playing at the edge of our property, where the prairie meets the forest. We weren't supposed to be out there alone, but we were kids and didn't always listen. We were picking wildflowers when we heard a rustling in the trees. At first, we thought it was just the wind, but then we saw movement. A young deer, probably only a few months old, came bounding out of the forest. It was beautiful, all spindly legs and wide eyes. My sister squealed with delight, but her joy quickly turned to horror, because right behind the fawn, emerging from the shadows like a nightmare-given form, was one of the prairie people. I'd never seen one this close before. It was tall, easily 7 or 8 feet, with long, gangly limbs that seemed to bend in impossible ways. Its skin was a mottled grey-green, perfectly camouflaged for the prairie grass. But its face... God, its face. It was almost human, but twisted and wrong. The eyes were too big, the mouth too wide and filled with needle-sharp teeth. Before I could react, before I could grab my sister and run, the creature pounced. It moved with inhuman speed, closing the distance to the fawn in the blink of an eye. What happened next is seared into my memory forever. The prairie person caught the fawn with its long, clawed hands. The poor animal let out a terrified bleat that was cut short as the creature. I can barely bring myself to describe it. It tore into the fawn with those terrible teeth, ripping and tearing. Blood sprayed across the grass, vibrant red against the green. My sister was screaming. I was frozen in place, unable to look away from the horrific scene unfolding before us. The prairie person looked up from its grisly meal, its face smeared with blood. For a moment our eyes met, and I saw something in those alien orbs that chilled me to my core. Intelligence. Awareness. This wasn't just some mindless beast. It knew exactly what it was doing. I don't remember how we got back to the house. Everything after that moment is a blur. I just remember my parents' faces when we burst through the door, crying and babbling about what we'd seen. They believed us immediately. There was no doubt, no skepticism. They knew. That night my dad went out with his rifle. He was gone for hours. When he came back, he looked older somehow, worn down. He didn't say a word, just locked his gun away and went to bed. The next morning, life went on as if nothing had happened. My parents tried to explain it away, to make it seem less terrifying. It's just nature, they said. Sometimes nature is cruel, but it's not evil. The prairie people have to eat too. But I knew better. I'd seen the look in that creature's eyes. There was more to it than simple predation. The prairie people were intelligent, selective in their attacks. They understood boundaries and respect. And sometimes they chose to violate those boundaries to remind us of our place. Years have passed since that day, but I've never forgotten. I still live on the farm, taking care of the land like my parents and grandparents before me. The prairie people are still out there. We've come to an uneasy truce over the years. They stay in their territory, and we stay in ours, most of the time. But sometimes on quiet nights when the moon is full and the prairie grass whispers secrets to the wind, I hear them, moving in the darkness, watching, waiting. And I wonder, how long will this fragile peace last? What happens when the prairie people decide they want more than just their share of the land? I don't have answers. All I know is that out here, in the vast expanse of the prairie, we're not at the top of the food chain. We're not the masters of this domain. We're just visitors, tolerated for now by forces we can barely comprehend. So if you ever find yourself out here, in the heartland where the grass grows tall and the horizon seems endless, remember this: you're not alone. The prairie people are watching, and they're hungry. Story 22. Jimmy's family owned a huge tract of densely forested land, crisscrossed with old logging roads and ATV trails. We'd been riding those trails since we were kids, racing each other and exploring every hidden corner of the property. That night was crisp and clear, with a bright full moon illuminating the forest. Perfect conditions for a nighttime adventure. We set out around 10 p.m., bundled up in jackets and gloves against the chilly November air. The quad bike's headlights cut through the darkness as we wound our way deeper into the woods. For the first hour or so, everything was normal. Just two cousins cruising through the trees, enjoying the night air and the thrill of speed. Then things took a turn I'll never forget. We were about 5 miles out from the house, following a narrow trail that snaked along a steep hillside. Jimmy was in the lead, and I saw his brake lights suddenly flare as he came to an abrupt stop. I pulled up behind him, wondering what was wrong. "Did you hear that?" Jimmy called back to me, shutting off his engine. I killed my engine too and listened. For a moment, all I could hear was the light breeze rustling through the trees. Then I heard it, a deep, guttural huffing sound echoing through the forest. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before. Not quite human, not quite animal. The sound sent chills down my spine. "What the hell is that?" I whispered. Jimmy just shook his head, eyes wide with fear. The huffing grew louder, closer. Then came the sound of snapping branches and heavy footfalls. Whatever was making those noises was big, and it was heading straight for us. Suddenly, a massive shape burst out of the trees about 50 yards up the trail. In the moonlight, I caught a glimpse of matted fur, powerfully muscled limbs, and a face that looked almost human but wrong somehow. The creature stood at least 8 feet tall, with long arms that nearly dragged on the ground. For a split second we all froze, me, Jimmy, and this impossible being that shouldn't exist. Then the thing let out a bone-chilling roar that sounded like a mix between a gorilla and a bear. That snapped us out of our paralysis. "Go!" Jimmy yelled, gunning his engine. I didn't need to be told twice. I fired up my quad bike and we took off down the trail as fast as we dared. The creature gave chase immediately. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush behind us, moving with terrifying speed for something so large. Every few seconds, it would let out another of those gut-wrenching roars. The sound seemed to shake the very air around us. We raced along the twisting trail, pushing our bikes to the limit. The path was treacherous, barely wide enough for the quads, with a sheer drop-off to one side and dense forest on the other. One wrong move, and we'd go tumbling down the hillside. I was torn between watching the trail ahead and glancing back at our pursuer. Each time I looked back, the creature seemed to be gaining on us. Its inhuman speed defied belief. In the flashes I caught in my rearview mirror, I saw a face contorted with rage, eyes gleaming with predatory focus. "It's getting closer," I screamed to Jimmy. He just hunched lower over his handlebars, twisting the throttle for more speed. We came to a sharp bend in the trail. Jimmy took it way too fast, his back tire sliding dangerously close to the edge. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought he was going over. But somehow he regained control and kept going. I followed his line exactly, praying I'd make it too. Just as I straightened out from the turn, I heard a deafening roar right behind me. I felt the quad bike lurch as something massive swiped at my back tire. Sheer terror gave me a burst of adrenaline, and I opened the throttle wide, the engine screaming in protest. The next few minutes were a blur of terror and desperate speed. We flew down the trail recklessly, taking turns at speeds that should have sent us flying off the mountain. But somehow, we stayed on the bikes and stayed ahead of the monster on our tail. Finally, mercifully, I saw the lights of Jimmy's house through the trees. We burst out of the forest and into the cleared area around the house, not slowing down until we'd reached the front porch. We leapt off the bikes and ran inside, slamming and locking the door behind us. Jimmy's parents came running at the commotion. We must have looked insane, wild-eyed, breathless, covered in mud and scratches. Between gasps, we tried to explain what had happened. Jimmy's dad grabbed his rifle and went outside to look around, but of course there was no sign of our pursuer. We spent a sleepless night huddled in the living room, jumping at every little sound from outside. The next morning, Jimmy's dad drove us out to where we said we'd first seen the creature. We found some strange tracks in the mud, huge barefoot prints that looked almost human, but that was the only evidence of our encounter. To this day, I don't know what chased us through the woods that night. Bigfoot? Some undiscovered species? A hallucination brought on by fear and moonlight? I can't explain it. All I know is that I've never felt terror like I did during that pursuit. The memory of that roar still haunts my dreams sometimes. I haven't been back to those woods since that Thanksgiving. Jimmy says weird things still happen out there sometimes. Eerie sounds in the night, livestock going missing. But nothing as dramatic as what we experienced. It's like whatever that thing was just vanished back into the wilderness as suddenly as it had appeared. I've tried to rationalize it over the years, to convince myself it was just a bear or our imaginations running wild. But deep down, I know what I saw. There are things out there in the dark corners of the world that defy explanation. I just hope I never encounter one again. Story 23. I was just a kid when it happened, but the memory is seared into my brain like it was yesterday. It was the summer of '97, and I was staying with my grandparents at their ranch in rural Washington state. Grandpa had this sprawling property out in the boonies, surrounded by dense forest as far as the eye could see. I loved visiting every summer, running wild and free through the woods and helping out with the horses. That particular day started out normal enough. I woke up to the smell of Grandma's pancakes and the sound of Grandpa's work boots clomping down the hall. As I shoveled syrupy goodness into my mouth, Grandpa mentioned that one of the horses, Old Thunder, had gotten loose during the night. "Looks like we've got ourselves a little adventure today, kiddo," he said with a wink. "You up for helping your old granddad track down that ornery stallion?" Of course I was thrilled at the prospect. Any excuse to explore the forest was fine by me. So after breakfast we set out, Grandpa with his rifle slung over his shoulder, in case of cougars, he always said, and me practically vibrating with excitement. The day was overcast and gloomy, with a damp chill in the air that made me glad for my flannel jacket. As we hiked deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to press in closer, their branches creating a canopy that blocked out most of the weak sunlight. The forest floor was carpeted with ferns and moss, muffling our footsteps. For hours we searched, following hoof prints and broken branches. I was starting to get tired and cranky when Grandpa suddenly stopped short, holding up a hand for silence. At first, I didn't see anything. But then I noticed movement high up in a massive old cedar tree about 50 yards away. My first thought was that it must be a bear. But as I squinted to get a better look, I realized this was something different. It was vaguely ape-like in shape, but much larger than any ape I'd ever seen pictures of. Its body was covered in reddish-brown fur, and its long arms gripped the tree branches with surprising dexterity. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I could make out more details. The creature's face was flat and oddly human-like, with deep-set eyes that gleamed with unmistakable intelligence. A wave of primal fear washed over me as I realized those eyes were staring right at us. Grandpa's hand tightened on my shoulder. "Don't move," he whispered, his voice tense. With agonizing slowness, he brought his rifle up to his shoulder. The creature's reaction was explosive. In a blur of movement, it snapped off a huge branch as thick as my leg and hurled it towards us with incredible force. The branch whistled past my ear, missing me by inches. I yelped in terror and stumbled backwards. Grandpa fired off a shot, the sound shockingly loud in the quiet forest. But the creature was already on the move, swinging through the treetops with impossible speed and grace. In seconds, it had vanished into the depths of the forest, leaving only swaying branches in its wake. For a long moment, we stood frozen in shocked silence. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. I turned to look at Grandpa, expecting to see the same fear I felt reflected on his face. But his expression was grim and resigned, like he'd seen a ghost from his past rather than an impossible monster. "Grandpa," I whispered, my voice shaking. What was that thing?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring off in the direction the creature had fled. Finally, he sighed heavily and knelt down beside me, putting his hands on my shoulders. "Listen to me carefully," he said, his voice low and urgent. "What we saw here today, it doesn't exist. You understand? Nobody would believe us if we told them, and some folks might think we were crazy. So we're not going to tell anyone. Not Grandma, not your parents, not your friends back home. Nobody. This is our secret just between you and me. Can you promise me that?" I nodded solemnly, still too shaken to speak. Grandpa pulled me into a tight hug, then stood up and shouldered his rifle. "Come on," he said gruffly. "Let's head back to the ranch. I reckon old Thunder will find his own way home when he gets hungry enough." The trek back was tense and silent. Every snapping twig or rustle in the underbrush made me jump. I kept imagining red eyes watching us from the shadows. When we finally emerged from the tree line and I saw the comforting sight of the ranch house, I nearly cried with relief. That night, I lay awake for hours, replaying the encounter over and over in my mind, the intelligence in those eyes, the raw power as it snapped that huge branch like a twig, the blinding speed of its escape. It defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. In the years since, I've done a lot of research trying to make sense of what I saw that day. I've read about Bigfoot sightings and other cryptid encounters, but nothing quite matches up with what we experienced. That creature was like nothing else on Earth. I've kept my promise to Grandpa all these years. He passed away a decade ago, taking whatever he knew about that thing to his grave. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all, if the mind of a frightened child turned a bear or some other mundane animal into a monster. But then I remember the look in Grandpa's eyes, and I know it was real. To this day, I can't look at the forests of the Pacific Northwest the same way. Those deep, shadowy woods that once filled me with childlike wonder now hold a sense of lurking menace. What else might be hiding out there, just beyond the edges of our understanding? I still visit the old ranch sometimes, though it belongs to one of my cousins now. I've never ventured back into those particular woods, but sometimes when dusk is falling and the shadows grow long, I'll stand at the edge of the forest and peer into the gathering darkness. And I swear I can feel eyes watching me from the gloom, ancient, intelligent eyes that hold secrets we were never meant to know. I don't know what that creature was, or if others like it still roam the wilderness. But I do know that the world is stranger and more mysterious than most people realize. There are things out there that defy explanation, lurking just beyond the fringes of our everyday reality. And sometimes, if we're not careful, we might just catch a glimpse of them. That day in the forest changed me forever. It opened my eyes to possibilities I'd never considered before. And it left me with a lingering sense of unease, a nagging feeling that we humans aren't quite as alone on this planet as we'd like to believe. So if you're ever hiking in the deep woods of the Pacific Northwest and you feel eyes upon you, if you hear branches cracking in a way that sounds just a little too deliberate, if you catch a whiff of a musky animal scent that doesn't quite belong, well, you might want to turn around and head back to civilization, because there are some mysteries out there that are better left unsolved. As for me, I'll never forget that summer day when the impossible became real. The memory of those piercing eyes and that inhuman strength will haunt me for the rest of my days. And sometimes, in my dreams, I'm back in that forest, a frightened child staring up at a creature that shouldn't exist, while the world I thought I knew crumbles around me. Story 24. I was always skeptical about Bigfoot stories, but after what happened during our winter camping trip to Mount Washington, I'm not so sure anymore. It was supposed to be a fun adventure with my closest friends, but it turned into something I still can't fully explain. There were 5 of us, me, Jake, Emily, Chris, and Megan. We'd been planning this trip for months, excited to challenge ourselves with some winter camping and hopefully catch some amazing views from the summit. We arrived at the base of Mount Washington on a crisp February morning, the air so cold it hurt to breathe. As we started our hike up, everything seemed normal at first. The trail was tough going with all our gear and the deep snow, but we were in good spirits. It wasn't until we'd been hiking for a few hours that I started to notice something odd. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds chirping, no squirrels scampering around. I mentioned it to the others, and Emily agreed it was strange. "Maybe all the animals are just hiding from the cold," Jake suggested with a shrug. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. We set up camp for the night in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines heavy with snow. As we huddled around our little camp stove eating dinner, Chris suddenly sat up straight, his eyes wide. "Did you guys hear that?" he whispered. We all fell silent, straining to listen. At first, I didn't hear anything, but then a low, rumbling sound in the distance. Almost like a deep growl, but not quite like any animal I'd ever heard before. "It's probably just the wind," Megan said, but she didn't sound convinced. We were all on edge after that, jumping at every little noise. I barely slept that night, tossing and turning in my sleeping bag. Every time I dozed off, I'd jerk awake, sure I'd heard something moving outside the tent. The next morning, we woke to find enormous footprints in the snow all around our campsite. They were easily twice the size of a human foot, with 5 distinct toe impressions. My blood ran cold as I stared at them, my mind racing to come up with some rational explanation. But deep down, I knew these weren't from any normal animal. "Holy shit," Jake breathed, crouching down to examine one of the prints. "Guys, you don't think... it couldn't be, right?" None of us wanted to say it out loud, but we were all thinking the same thing. Bigfoot. It seemed insane, but what else could leave tracks like that? Emily wanted to pack up and head back down the mountain immediately. But Chris was fascinated, insisting we should try to follow the tracks and see where they led. "This could be the discovery of the century," he exclaimed, practically bouncing with excitement. "We have to investigate." I was torn. Part of me was terrified and wanted nothing more than to get the hell out of there. But another part was intensely curious. What if we really did find proof of Bigfoot? In the end, we compromised. We'd continue our hike as planned, but keep our eyes peeled for any more signs. As we hiked that day, the sense of unease grew stronger. The silence in the forest was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of our boots in the snow and our own labored breathing in the thin mountain air. We didn't talk much, each lost in our own thoughts. I kept imagining I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and see nothing but trees and snow. We stopped for a break around midday, perching on some fallen logs to eat a quick lunch. That's when Megan spotted it, another set of those massive footprints leading off into a thick stand of trees. Chris immediately wanted to follow them, but Jake held him back. "Dude, we don't know what's out there," he warned. "Let's just stick to the trail and get to our next campsite." Reluctantly, Chris agreed. But as we continued our hike, I could see him constantly scanning the trees, hoping for another glimpse of those tracks. I have to admit, I was doing the same. The idea that we might actually see a Bigfoot was both thrilling and terrifying. We reached our planned campsite late in the afternoon and quickly set up our tents. The sun was already sinking behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow. As darkness fell, that feeling of being watched intensified. I couldn't shake the sensation that there were eyes on us, hidden somewhere in the gloom beyond our little circle of light. We tried to keep things normal, joking around as we cooked dinner on the camp stove. But there was an undercurrent of tension that we couldn't quite shake. Every snapping twig or rustle of branches had us all on high alert. I woke up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding. Something had woken me, but I wasn't sure what. I lay perfectly still, ears straining. Then I heard it, heavy footsteps crunching in the snow, circling our campsite. They were slow, deliberate. Whatever it was big. I was paralyzed with fear, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps came closer, then paused right outside my tent. I could hear deep, huffing breaths. My mind was screaming at me to do something. Yell for help, grab my flashlight, anything. But I couldn't move a muscle. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps slowly moved away. I lay there for the rest of the night, wide awake and trembling, convinced that at any moment the thing would come back. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped my tent with shaking hands, half expecting to see a monster looming over me. But there was nothing there, just pristine snow and the silent forest. I was starting to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing when Emily called out in a shaky voice, "Guys, you need to see this." We all scrambled out of our tents. Emily was standing at the edge of our campsite, pointing at the ground. There, in the fresh snow, was a line of those massive footprints leading right up to where our tents were pitched. They circled the entire campsite before heading off into the trees. "Oh my God," Megan whispered. "It was here. It was right here while we were sleeping." Chris was practically vibrating with excitement. "We have to follow it," he insisted. "This is our chance." But the rest of us had had enough. Emily was in tears, begging to go home. Even Jake, usually the most level-headed of us, looked shaken. We quickly packed up camp, all plans of summiting Mount Washington forgotten. Our only goal now was to get off this mountain as fast as possible. We'd been hiking for maybe an hour when it happened. We came around a bend in the trail, and there it was, about 50 yards ahead of us. A massive, fur-covered figure, easily 8 feet tall. It was walking slowly through the snow, its back to us. We all froze, hardly daring to breathe. I felt like I was in a dream or a nightmare. This couldn't be real. But I was seeing it with my own eyes. Bigfoot. An actual, honest-to-God Bigfoot. It must have heard us, because it suddenly stopped and turned its head. I caught a glimpse of a face that was somehow both ape-like and disturbingly human. Our eyes met for a split second, and I felt a jolt of something. Recognition, intelligence. I'm not sure. But in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that this was no ordinary animal. Then it turned and loped off into the trees with surprising speed for something so large. Within seconds, it had vanished from sight. We stood there in stunned silence for a long moment. Then Emily started crying, and that snapped us all out of it. We practically ran down that mountain, not stopping until we reached the parking lot where we'd left our cars. It's been months since that trip, and I still don't know how to process what happened. We all agreed not to tell anyone. Who would believe us anyway? But I can't stop thinking about it. About those footprints in the snow, those heavy breathing outside my tent in the night. And most of all, about those eyes meeting mine, filled with an intelligence I can't explain. I used to think Bigfoot was just a myth, a fun story to tell around campfires. Now, I'm not so sure. All I know is that there's something out there in those mountains, something that defies explanation. And I don't think I'll ever look at the wilderness the same way again. Story 25. I've never been much of a believer in the paranormal or cryptids, but after what happened to my wife and I last summer, I'm not so sure anymore. It still feels surreal talking about it, but I need to get this off my chest. My wife and I met at a Bigfoot enthusiasts panel a few years back. We instantly bonded over our shared fascination with the legendary creature. We'd spend hours discussing sighting reports, analyzing footprint casts, and debating the latest theories. It was a fun hobby that brought us closer together. Last July, we decided to take our passion to the next level and plan a Bigfoot expedition of our own. We chose Olympic National Park in Washington State as our destination. The dense, misty forests seemed like the perfect habitat for an elusive primate to hide. We spent months meticulously planning every detail, researching reported sighting locations, mapping out hiking routes, and assembling all the gear we'd need. Trail cameras, night vision goggles, audio recorders, you name it. My wife even knitted us matching Bigfoot sweaters for the trip. Looking back, our enthusiasm seems almost naive now. The day we arrived at Olympic, I remember feeling a mix of excitement and nervous energy. The towering evergreens and thick fog created an eerie atmosphere. As we hiked deeper into the wilderness, leaving the well-traveled paths behind, I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. We spent the first few days setting up camp and scouting the area, looking for signs of unusual activity. Broken branches, strange prints, tufts of hair, anything out of the ordinary. On the third night, we heard our first unsettling sounds. A series of howls echoed through the forest, unlike anything I'd heard before. Not quite human, not quite animal. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My wife was ecstatic, convinced it was proof of Bigfoot. I tried to stay rational, suggesting it could be wolves or even other campers messing around. But deep down, I knew this was different. We barely slept that night, straining our ears for any other noises. The next morning, we found large humanoid footprints near our campsite. They were over 15 inches long and deeply pressed into the mud. My hands trembled as I took photos and measurements. This was the closest we'd ever come to real evidence. We decided to follow the tracks deeper into the forest. In hindsight, that was our crucial mistake. As we pushed further from camp, the forest seemed to close in around us. The mist grew thicker, muffling sounds and limiting visibility. I started to feel disoriented, like we were walking in circles. That's when we first saw it. Through a break in the trees about 50 yards away, a massive dark figure lumbered by. It moved with an odd gait, not quite upright like a human, but not on all fours either. My wife gasped and grabbed my arm. We froze, hardly daring to breathe. The creature paused, as if sensing our presence. Slowly, it turned its head in our direction. I'll never forget that face, somewhere between ape and man, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow with intelligence. For a moment, we just stared at each other, neither moving. Then I made a critical error. Overcome with the need to document this incredible encounter, I fumbled for my camera. As soon as I raised it, the creature's demeanor changed instantly. Its lips pulled back in a snarl, revealing yellowed teeth. A deep, guttural roar filled the air. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing my wife's hand. We took off, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces. I could hear heavy footsteps and snapping twigs behind us as the creature gave chase. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. We sprinted blindly through the fog, having no idea which direction led back to camp. At one point, I glanced back and caught a glimpse of our pursuer. It was gaining on us quickly, moving with surprising speed for its bulky frame. Suddenly, my foot caught on a root, and I went sprawling. The camera flew from my hands, disappearing into the undergrowth. My wife helped me up and we kept running, leaving the expensive equipment behind without a second thought. I'm not sure how long we ran for. It felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Eventually, the sounds of pursuit faded and we collapsed, gasping for air. We huddled together, straining our ears for any sign the creature was still nearby. As our breathing steadied, an eerie silence settled over the forest. No birds, no insects, nothing. It was as if the whole wood was holding its breath. We waited there for what seemed like an eternity, too terrified to move. Finally, we gathered the courage to try finding our way back to camp. It took hours of wandering before we recognized any landmarks. When we finally stumbled into our campsite, we immediately began packing up. There was no way we were spending another night out there. The drive home was tense and quiet. We were both still processing what we'd experienced. Part of me wanted to rationalize it away. Maybe it was just a bear, and our frightened minds filled in the details. But I knew that wasn't true. What we saw was no ordinary animal. It's been months now, and we still struggle to talk about that day. We lost thousands of dollars worth of equipment fleeing through the woods. But worse than that is the lingering fear, the feeling that we glimpsed something we weren't meant to see. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, imagining that creature's eyes staring at me through our bedroom window. My wife says she often feels watched when she's alone in the house. We've stopped going hiking or camping. The wilderness that once called to us now feels threatening. I know how this story must sound to skeptics. Before it happened to me, I probably wouldn't have believed it either. But I know what I saw out there in Olympic National Park. There are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that lurk just beyond the edge of civilization. We went looking for Bigfoot that day, driven by curiosity and the thrill of discovery. But we weren't prepared for the reality of coming face to face with something truly unknown. Now I understand why these creatures stay hidden, and why those who encounter them often stay silent. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some truths are too terrifying to face. I don't know if we'll ever fully recover from what happened that day in the misty forests of Washington. But I do know one thing for certain. I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again.